Hey friend, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. Tonight we're going somewhere most people only see from the outside. Not a museum exhibit, not a guided tour, not a polished photograph in a history book. We're going inside, all the way inside, into the walls, the corridors, the kitchens, the attics, the hidden passages and gleaming drawing rooms of a Victorian mansion, at the height of its power and its complexity. Most people, when they imagine a great house from the 1800s, picture the beautiful parts. The sweeping staircase rising from a marble entrance hall, the drawing room with its towering windows and velvet curtains, the dining table set for 20 with silverware that catches the candlelight just so. And all of that was real, absolutely real, and we'll spend a great deal of time inside those rooms tonight. But here is the thing that most people miss entirely. A Victorian mansion was not a home the way we understand that word today. It was a machine. An enormous, complicated, fuel-hungry, labour-devouring machine that required dozens of people working in a precise hierarchy, starting before dawn and finishing well after dark just to keep it functioning. The beautiful parts, the gleaming marble and the perfectly laid table, those were the output. The engine that produced them ran hot and hidden in the depth of the house, staffed by people whose entire existence was organised around maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance upstairs. So tonight we're going to take that machine apart piece by piece, slowly and gently, until you understand not just what the house looked like, but how it breathed, how it heated itself, how it fed its inhabitants, how it stayed clean, how it managed its own darkness, and what it actually felt like to move through its corridors at different hours of the day. Before we begin, if this kind of storytelling feels like the right company for a quiet evening, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed to Sleepy Old World and left a like on the video. This channel exists because of the people who keep returning to it, and every new subscriber genuinely helps more stories like this one reach more people looking for something to drift off to at the end of the day. Now settle in. The house is waiting. Picture a Thursday morning in October of 1887. The address is a street in the West End of London, though it could just as easily be a country house in Wiltshire or a merchant's estate in Edinburgh. The details shift a little from house to house, but the essential machinery is remarkably consistent across all of them. The street is quiet at this hour, just past 5 in the morning. A light frost has settled on the paving stones overnight. The gas lamps are still burning, casting small pools of amber light onto the empty pavement. From the outside, the house presents a face of complete self-possession. 5 stories of a honey-coloured Portland stone rise above the street, each floor marked by a horizontal band of carved detail. The windows on the upper floors are dark. The tall sash windows of the reception rooms on the ground floor reflect the lamplight in long pale bars. The iron railings that separate the house from the pavement are painted glossy black. The front steps are wide and shallow and swept clean. Everything about the exterior announces that the people who live here are serious, prosperous, and in complete control of their surroundings. But the house is not asleep. In the basement, which runs the full footprint of the building and then some, lights are already on. Not gas lamps, candles at this hour, carried from room to room by the first servants to rise. The kitchen range, a vast black iron structure that occupies most of one wall, has been lit and is beginning its long, slow process of coming to temperature. It will burn coal all day, every day, and in a house of this size the range is essentially never fully extinguished. Coals are banked overnight to hold heat, and the first task of the kitchen maid who rises at 5:30 is to rake those coals forward, add fresh fuel, and begin the process of building the fires back up to working temperature. That single detail, the coal range coming to life before dawn, is actually the key to understanding almost everything about how this house functions. Because heat, in a Victorian mansion is not a background condition. It is a daily production. It must be planned for, paid for, procured, stored, carried up flights of stairs in heavy metal scuttles, loaded into fireplaces and ranges and boilers, and then managed hour by hour to ensure that the right rooms are warm at the right times, while the coal supply lasts through the month without running over budget. Let us start with the house itself, because understanding the physical structure is what makes everything else make sense. The architecture of a Victorian mansion was not arbitrary. Every floor, every staircase, every door and corridor and hidden passage was the product of a very specific social philosophy. That philosophy, stated plainly, was this: the people who own the house and the people who work in the house should be able to inhabit the same building simultaneously without ever having to acknowledge each other's existence. The owners would move through a world of wide corridors, high ceilings, and polished surfaces. The servants would move through a parallel world of narrow passages, low ceilings, and plain deal-board floors. The two worlds would intersect only at carefully controlled moments, managed by bells and schedules and a chain of command so precise that a visiting guest would see a household running as smoothly as a Swiss watch, with no visible evidence of the machinery making it run. The front of the house was the family's world. The entrance hall, with its black and white tiled floor and its tall coat stand and the glass bowl always filled with fresh cards from recent callers. The morning room, where the mistress of the house spent her mornings attending to correspondence and receiving informal visits. The library, which smelled of leather and old paper and was primarily the master's domain. The dining room, which in a house of this size could seat 30 with reasonable comfort. The drawing room, the grandest of all the reception rooms, with its high plaster ceiling and its marble chimney piece, and its arrangement of furniture designed to facilitate exactly the kind of carefully orchestrated social performance that Victorian upper-middle-class life required. Then there was the staircase. The main staircase in a house like this was genuinely spectacular. Wide, shallow steps of polished stone or hardwood, sweeping upward in a broad curve with an iron or carved wooden balustrade. The staircase was visible from the entrance hall and was itself a statement about the family's position. Visitors climbing it were meant to feel the scale of the house, to be impressed without being overwhelmed, to understand that they were guests in a serious establishment. The upper floors held the bedrooms. The master and mistress had separate bedrooms connected by a dressing room, which was standard Victorian practice and carried no particular social meaning. It was simply considered more comfortable that way, and it allowed each person's morning and evening routines to proceed without interference. Guest bedrooms occupied the floors above, graded in size and furnishing according to how important the expected guest was. An earl would be given the best guest room with the south-facing windows and the best bed. A less distinguished friend of the family might find themselves in a smaller room on the upper story with a view of the back garden. And then there were the nurseries, which in a prosperous Victorian household occupied their own self-contained world on the top floor. The day nursery, where children spent their daylight hours under the supervision of a nurse, and the night nursery where they slept, formed a kind of household within the household. Children in these families were both beloved and largely invisible to adult social life. They were brought down to the drawing room at tea time, scrubbed and dressed and rehearsed in their manners, presented to company for perhaps half an hour, and then returned to their upper floor world. The nurse and the nursery maids who managed them reported to the housekeeper, but operated with considerable independence within their own domain. Now let us cross an invisible threshold that most visitors to the house would never cross, and find the servants' world. The division between the family's side of the house and the servants' side was not simply a matter of which rooms you were in. It was a matter of which staircase you used, which corridors you walked, and which doors you came through. Great Victorian houses were designed with two entirely separate circulation systems, running through the same building like two independent road networks overlaid on the same map and almost never touching. The service staircase was the servants' highway. It ran from the basement to the top floor at the back of the house, narrow and steep and functional, with plain painted walls and worn treads and no decoration of any kind. This was the staircase used dozens of times a day by every member of the domestic staff, carrying coal and water and linens and breakfast trays and chamber pots and everything else that needed to move through the house without being seen. A housemaid carrying a heavy coal scuttle to a third-floor bedroom could travel the entire height of the house from bottom to top without ever entering the main staircase hall. A footman bringing sherry to the library could emerge from a concealed door in the hallway that was, from the family's perspective, essentially invisible, papered over and hinged at the side so that when closed it looked like a section of wall. These concealed doors were not unusual. In a well-designed Victorian house they were systematic. There would be a door into the dining room from the butler's pantry that allowed service to proceed without anyone having to pass through the entrance hall. There would be a service door into the drawing room, concealed behind a curtain or a bookcase. There would be hatches and dumbwaiters connecting floors vertically for the movement of dishes and hot water without requiring a servant to carry them up full flights of stairs. The invisible infrastructure of service movement was built into the very bones of the house. Below stairs was a world unto itself. The basement of a Victorian mansion was not the damp, cobwebby space that modern imagination might supply. It was busy, purposeful, and in its own way quite well organized, though never comfortable. The kitchen occupied the largest and best lit space, running the full width of the back of the house, with windows that gave onto the below-ground area, the sunken courtyard, accessed from the street by the iron area steps that servants and tradespeople used for deliveries. The scullery, where washing up was done and the roughest kitchen work performed, adjoined the kitchen on one side. The larders, the cold larder for meat and dairy, the dry larder for dry goods and preserves, were positioned on the north side of the house to take advantage of cool temperatures. The butler's pantry, where silver was cleaned and stored, and the butler managed his domain, was at the front of the basement, near the stairs that led up to the dining room. Further along the basement corridor, there would be the housekeeper's room, which served as both her office and her private sitting room, and was one of the few spaces below stairs where there was any real comfort. There would be the servants' hall, the communal dining and sitting room where most of the domestic staff took their meals and spent any free time they had. There would be a lamp room where oil lamps were cleaned and filled and trimmed and stored, a coal store receiving deliveries through a chute from the pavement above, a wine cellar which the butler kept locked with his own key and which was not accessible to the rest of the staff, storerooms for cleaning materials and household equipment, a boot room where outdoor footwear was cleaned and stored, a room for brushing and airing clothes, and somewhere, usually tucked into an awkward corner beneath the stairs, the housemaid's closet where cleaning equipment was kept. The total below-stairs staff in a house like this, in the height of the Victorian era, might number anywhere from 10 to 20 people depending on the size of the family, the scale of their entertaining, and their income. A modest establishment might manage with 8 or 9. A grand one might have 30. What is consistent is the hierarchy, because the hierarchy was what made the whole system function. At the very top of the household was the master of the house himself, who in the language of the time was simply the master and his wife the mistress. They employed everyone, they set the tone, they determined the style of the household, and they were the ultimate authority on all matters. But day to day, the running of the house was delegated to 2 people who operated in parallel and rarely directly reported to each other, the butler and the housekeeper. The butler was the most senior of the male servants, and his authority below stairs was nearly absolute over the male staff. He was responsible for the dining room and the service of food and wine. He managed the footman and the hall boy. He had sole control of the wine cellar. He oversaw the care of the silver. He answered the front door in the absence of the footman, and in a well-run house he was always the last to go to bed at night and among the first to rise in the morning, because securing the house for the night and ensuring it was ready to receive the family's morning requirements were both his responsibility. The housekeeper was the butler's equivalent on the female side, and her authority was in some ways more pervasive because it covered more of the house. She managed all the maids, the housemaids who cleaned and maintained the family's rooms, the ladies' maids who attended to the mistress and female guests, the laundry maids, the still-room maids. She controlled the household stores. She held a vast ring of keys that opened every storeroom and cupboard in the house, and this physical fact of the keys was not merely practical, it was symbolic. The housekeeper's chatelaine, that ornamental chain from which the keys hung at her waist, announced her authority to every person in the house. In a large establishment she might have an assistant, called a head housemaid, but ultimately all the threads of female household management ran through her hands. She was, in most houses, a woman of considerable age and experience. She had usually begun her career as a housemaid or a lady's maid decades earlier, worked her way up through a series of positions in increasingly grand establishments, and arrived at the housekeeper's post after 20 or 30 years of service. She addressed all the housemaids by their first names or their surnames without a title. She was addressed by everyone, including the butler, as Mrs., followed by her surname, a courtesy title indicating her status, since most housekeepers were not in fact married. She took her meals alone in her sitting room, where the upper servants sometimes joined her for dessert after the main servants' hall dinner. This custom of the senior servants separating themselves from the junior ones at mealtimes tells you a great deal about how Victorian domestic hierarchy actually worked. It was not simply a division between family and servants. It was a multi-layered pyramid with dozens of gradations, each one carefully observed. The senior servants, the butler and housekeeper and cook and lady's maid and valet, occupied a middle world between the family above and the junior servants below. They were not family. They were not peers of the housemaid who scrubbed the grate. They were something in between, and they maintained their middle position with the same attention to status that the family brought to the question of who was invited to dinner. The cook was the third great power in the below-stairs world, and she occupied a slightly unusual position in the hierarchy. In terms of her skills and her importance to the daily functioning of the house, she was indispensable. A great cook could make or break the social reputation of the family she worked for, but in the formal hierarchy, she sat slightly below the housekeeper, and this could produce tensions in houses where the cook had strong opinions about her own importance. In the Victorian servants' world, the cook was addressed as Mrs., regardless of her actual marital status, in recognition of her seniority, but she occupied her own domain, the kitchen, with an authority that was essentially total within those walls. The footmen were the male servants most visible to the family and their guests. They wore livery, that is, a formal uniform in the household's colours, usually consisting of knee breeches, silk stockings, a tailored coat, and powdered hair or a wig on formal occasions, though the wig had largely fallen out of fashion by the 1880s. Their job was to serve at table, to attend the door, to carry messages within the house, to accompany family members on outings, to hand ladies out of carriages, and to perform the 1,000 small services that kept the reception rooms running smoothly. They were expected to be tall, well-made, and presentable, because they were, in a very real sense, part of the decoration of the house. A family that could afford 2 tall footmen in matching livery was demonstrating its prosperity as surely as the painting over the mantelpiece. Footmen addressed the family as Sir and Ma'am, and the upper servants as Mr. and Mrs. Their own first names were sometimes, in the grandest establishments, changed to suit the household. A footman named David might be asked to go by William, simply because the family had always had a William in the position and found it easier. This practice, casual to the point of absurdity from a modern perspective, was understood at the time as simply part of the terms of service. The housemaids formed the largest group in the female staff, and their work was in some ways the most physically demanding of all the household positions. A first housemaid, sometimes called the head housemaid in a large establishment, managed the other maids and was responsible for the upper floors of the house. Under her were second and third housemaids, each with their own defined territory and their own schedule of daily and weekly tasks. The housemaid's work began before any of the family was awake and continued until well into the evening. It was exhausting, repetitive, and largely invisible, invisible being, of course, the entire point. Let us follow one housemaid through a single morning and begin to feel the texture of this world. Let us start with the house itself, because understanding the physical structure is what makes everything else make sense. The architecture of a Victorian mansion was not arbitrary. Every floor, every staircase, every door and corridor and hidden passage was the product of a very specific social philosophy. That philosophy, stated plainly, was this: The people who own the house and the people who work in the house should be able to inhabit the same building simultaneously without ever having to acknowledge each other's existence. The owners would move through a world of wide corridors, high ceilings, and polished surfaces. The servants would move through a parallel world of narrow passages, low ceilings, and plain deal-board floors. The two worlds would intersect only at carefully controlled moments, managed by bells and schedules, and a chain of command so precise that a visiting guest would see a household running as smoothly as a Swiss watch, with no visible evidence of the machinery making it run. The front of the house was the family's world. The entrance hall, with its black and white tiled floor and its tall coat stand, and the glass bowl always filled with fresh cards from recent callers. The morning room, where the mistress of the house spent her mornings attending to correspondence and receiving informal visits. The library, which smelled of leather and old paper and was primarily the master's domain. The dining room, which in a house of this size could seat 30 with reasonable comfort. The drawing room, the grandest of all the reception rooms, with its high plaster ceiling and its marble chimney-piece, and its arrangement of furniture designed to facilitate exactly the kind of carefully orchestrated social performance that Victorian upper-middle-class life required. Then there was the staircase. The main staircase in a house like this was genuinely spectacular. Wide, shallow steps of polished stone or hardwood, sweeping upward in a broad curve with an iron or carved wooden balustrade. The staircase was visible from the entrance hall and was itself a statement about the family's position. Visitors climbing it were meant to feel the scale of the house, to be impressed without being overwhelmed, to understand that they were guests in a serious establishment. The upper floors held the bedrooms. The master and mistress had separate bedrooms connected by a dressing room, which was standard Victorian practice and carried no particular social meaning. It was simply considered more comfortable that way, and it allowed each person's morning and evening routines to proceed without interference. Guest bedrooms occupied the floors above, graded in size and furnishing according to how important the expected guest was. An earl would be given the best guest room with the south-facing windows and the best bed. A less distinguished friend of the family might find themselves in a smaller room on the upper story with a view of the back garden. And then there were the nurseries, which in a prosperous Victorian household occupied their own self-contained world on the top floor. The day nursery, where children spent their daylight hours under the supervision of a nurse, and the night nursery where they slept, formed a kind of household within the household. Children in these families were both beloved and largely invisible to adult social life. They were brought down to the drawing room at tea time, scrubbed and dressed and rehearsed in their manners, presented to company for perhaps half an hour, and then returned to their upper floor world. The nurse and the nursery maids who managed them reported to the housekeeper, but operated with considerable independence within their own domain. Now let us cross an invisible threshold that most visitors to the house would never cross, and find the servants' world. The division between the family's side of the house and the servants' side was not simply a matter of which rooms you were in. It was a matter of which staircase you used, which corridors you walked, and which doors you came through. Great Victorian houses were designed with two entirely separate circulation systems, running through the same building like two independent road networks overlaid on the same map and almost never touching. The service staircase was the servants' highway. It ran from the basement to the top floor at the back of the house, narrow and steep and functional, with plain painted walls and worn treads and no decoration of any kind. This was the staircase used dozens of times a day by every member of the domestic staff, carrying coal and water and linens and breakfast trays and chamber pots and everything else that needed to move through the house without being seen. A housemaid carrying a heavy coal scuttle to a third-floor bedroom could travel the entire height of the house from bottom to top without ever entering the main staircase hall. A footman bringing sherry to the library could emerge from a concealed door in the hallway that was, from the family's perspective, essentially invisible, papered over and hinged at the side, so that when closed it looked like a section of wall. These concealed doors were not unusual. In a well-designed Victorian house they were systematic. There would be a door into the dining room from the butler's pantry that allowed service to proceed without anyone having to pass through the entrance hall. There would be a service door into the drawing room concealed behind a curtain or a bookcase. There would be hatches and dumbwaiters connecting floors vertically for the movement of dishes and hot water without requiring a servant to carry them up full flights of stairs. The invisible infrastructure of service movement was built into the very bones of the house. Below stairs was a world unto itself. The basement of a Victorian mansion was not the damp, cobwebby space that modern imagination might supply. It was busy, purposeful, and in its own way quite well organized, though never comfortable. The kitchen occupied the largest and best lit space, running the full width of the back of the house with windows that gave onto the below-ground area. The sunken courtyard accessed from the street by the iron area steps that servants and tradespeople used for deliveries. The scullery, where washing up was done and the roughest kitchen work performed, adjoined the kitchen on one side. The larders, the cold larder for meat and dairy, the dry larder for dry goods and preserves, were positioned on the north side of the house to take advantage of cool temperatures. The butler's pantry, where silver was cleaned and stored and the butler managed his domain, was at the front of the basement, near the stairs that led up to the dining room. Further along the basement corridor, there would be the housekeeper's room, which served as both her office and her private sitting room, and was one of the few spaces below stairs where there was any real comfort. There would be the servants' hall, the communal dining and sitting room where most of the domestic staff took their meals and spent any free time they had. There would be a lamp room where oil lamps were cleaned and filled and trimmed and stored, a coal store receiving deliveries through a chute from the pavement above, a wine cellar which the butler kept locked with his own key and which was not accessible to the rest of the staff, storerooms for cleaning materials and household equipment, a boot room where outdoor footwear was cleaned and stored, a room for brushing and airing clothes, and somewhere, usually tucked into an awkward corner beneath the stairs, the housemaid's closet where cleaning equipment was kept. The total below-stairs staff in a house like this, in the height of the Victorian era, might number anywhere from 10 to 20 people depending on the size of the family, the scale of their entertaining and their income. A modest establishment might manage with 8 or 9. A grand one might have 30. What is consistent is the hierarchy, because the hierarchy was what made the whole system function. At the very top of the household was the master of the house himself, who in the language of the time was simply the master, and his wife the mistress. They employed everyone, they set the tone, they determined the style of the household, and they were the ultimate authority on all matters. But day to day, the running of the house was delegated to 2 people who operated in parallel and rarely directly reported to each other, the butler and the housekeeper. The butler was the most senior of the male servants, and his authority below stairs was nearly absolute over the male staff. He was responsible for the dining room and the service of food and wine. He managed the footmen and the hall boy. He had sole control of the wine cellar. He oversaw the care of the silver. He answered the front door in the absence of the footmen, and in a well-run house he was always the last to go to bed at night and among the first to rise in the morning, because securing the house for the night and ensuring it was ready to receive the family's morning requirements were both his responsibility. The housekeeper was the butler's equivalent on the female side, and her authority was in some ways more pervasive because it covered more of the house. She managed all the maids, the housemaids who cleaned and maintained the family's rooms, the ladies' maids who attended to the mistress and female guests, the laundry maids, the still-room maids. She controlled the household stores. She held a vast ring of keys that opened every storeroom and cupboard in the house, and this physical fact of the keys was not merely practical, it was symbolic. The housekeeper's chatelaine, that ornamental chain from which the keys hung at her waist, announced her authority to every person in the house. In a large establishment she might have an assistant, called a head housemaid, but ultimately all the threads of female household management ran through her hands. She was, in most houses, a woman of considerable age and experience. She had usually begun her career as a housemaid or a lady's maid decades earlier, worked her way up through a series of positions in increasingly grand establishments, and arrived at the housekeeper's post after 20 or 30 years of service. She addressed all the housemaids by their first names or their surnames without a title. She was addressed by everyone, including the butler, as Mrs., followed by her surname, a courtesy title indicating her status, since most housekeepers were not in fact married. She took her meals alone in her sitting room, where the upper servants sometimes joined her for dessert after the main servants' hall dinner. This custom of the senior servants separating themselves from the junior ones at mealtimes tells you a great deal about how Victorian domestic hierarchy actually worked. It was not simply a division between family and servants. It was a multi-layered pyramid with dozens of gradations, each one carefully observed. The senior servants, the butler and housekeeper and cook and lady's maid and valet, occupied a middle world between the family above and the junior servants below. They were not family. They were not peers of the housemaid who scrubbed the grate. They were something in between, and they maintained their middle position with the same attention to status that the family brought to the question of who was invited to dinner. The cook was the third great power in the below-stairs world, and she occupied a slightly unusual position in the hierarchy. In terms of her skills and her importance to the daily functioning of the house, she was indispensable. A great cook could make or break the social reputation of the family she worked for. But in the formal hierarchy, she sat slightly below the housekeeper, and this could produce tensions in houses where the cook had strong opinions about her own importance. In the Victorian servants' world, the cook was addressed as Mrs. regardless of her actual marital status, in recognition of her seniority, but she occupied her own domain, the kitchen, with an authority that was essentially total within those walls. The footmen were the male servants most visible to the family and their guests. They wore livery, that is, a formal uniform in the household's colours, usually consisting of knee breeches, silk stockings, a tailored coat, and powdered hair or a wig on formal occasions, though the wig had largely fallen out of fashion by the 1880s. Their job was to serve at table, to attend the door, to carry messages within the house, to accompany family members on outings, to hand ladies out of carriages, and to perform the 1,000 small services that kept the reception rooms running smoothly. They were expected to be tall, well-made, and presentable, because they were, in a very real sense, part of the decoration of the house. A family that could afford 2 tall footmen in matching livery was demonstrating its prosperity as surely as the painting over the mantelpiece. Footmen addressed the family as Sir and Ma'am, and the upper servants as Mr. and Mrs. Their own first names were sometimes, in the grandest establishments, changed to suit the household. A footman named David might be asked to go by William, simply because the family had always had a William in the position and found it easier. This practice, casual to the point of absurdity from a modern perspective, was understood at the time as simply part of the terms of service. The housemaids formed the largest group in the female staff, and their work was in some ways the most physically demanding of all the household positions. A first housemaid, sometimes called the head housemaid in a large establishment, managed the other maids and was responsible for the upper floors of the house. Under her were second and third housemaids, each with their own defined territory and their own schedule of daily and weekly tasks. The housemaid's work began before any of the family was awake and continued until well into the evening. It was exhausting, repetitive, and largely invisible, invisible being, of course, the entire point. Let us follow one housemaid through a single morning and begin to feel the texture of this world. Her name is Agnes. She is 22 years old and has been in service for 7 years, the last 3 in this house. She sleeps in a room on the top floor, a room she shares with another housemaid, and her alarm wakes her at 5:30 in the morning. The room is cold. In winter it is very cold, because the servants' rooms were not given the same heating consideration as the family's rooms, and the attic floor is the last to benefit from whatever warmth rises from below. She dresses quickly, in the dark at this hour, pulling on her working dress, a plain dark print cotton that she keeps specifically for the early morning hours when her work is dusty and the risk of staining is high. Over it goes a rough working apron. She pins her hair up without a mirror. She descends the back staircase to collect her cleaning equipment from the housemaid's closet, and then moves through the dark, silent house with the assurance of someone who could navigate it blindfolded, which in the winter months she very nearly has to. Her first task is the fires. The fireplaces in a Victorian mansion were not a comfort, they were a necessity, and maintaining them was one of the central daily labours of the household. In a house of this size there might be 15 or 20 fireplaces. Some burned every day through the winter months, regardless of whether the room was in use, the entrance hall, the servants' hall, the kitchen, because a cold, damp house deteriorated more quickly than a warm one, and the master was known to notice if a room felt neglected. Others burned only when the room was to be used, which meant that the housemaid responsible for those rooms needed to know the family's plans for the day, obtained through the housekeeper each morning, in order to know which fires to lay and which to leave unlit. Laying a fire properly was a skill, and doing it badly had consequences. A fire that smoked because the grate hadn't been properly cleaned, or that wouldn't draw because the flue hadn't been opened, or that went out after an hour because the coal had been laid too thickly, was a failure that would reach the housekeeper's ears by mid-morning. Agnes had learnt to do it well. She moved quickly and methodically, setting aside the fire guard, raking out the ashes from the previous day's fire into her ash pan, polishing the grate bars with black lead, that distinctive sharp-smelling paste that kept iron grates from rusting and gave them their characteristic dark gleam, laying the paper and kindling and small coals in the proper order, and finally, if the room was ready to use that morning, applying the match. In rooms not being used yet, she would lay the fire ready to light but leave it unlit, to be started later. The ash she collected was not simply thrown away. Ash from wood fires and clean coal ash could be used in the garden. Soot collected from chimney cleaning was valuable as a fertilizer and was sometimes sold to gardeners. Even the waste products of the house had their uses and their management systems. After the fires came the dusting of the reception rooms. This too had to happen before the family came downstairs, and it had to be done properly and in sequence. The drawing room first, because that was the grandest room and the one where any failure of cleanliness would be most noticed. Then the dining room, then the library, the morning room, the entrance hall. Each room had its own requirements. The drawing room had fragile objects on every surface, porcelain figurines, silver photograph frames, glass domes over wax flowers, small decorative items bought on continental tours, and dusting it required the patience of moving each item individually, wiping the surface beneath, and returning it to precisely its original position. The pattern of objects on the mantelpiece, and the arrangement of items on the whatnot, and the grouping of family photographs on the piano had been established by the mistress of the house over years, and any disruption of them would be noted immediately. Dusting in a Victorian house was not the simple task it might sound, because Victorian houses were extraordinarily dusty. This is not a failing of Victorian housekeeping. It is a product of the way the houses were heated and lit. Every coal fire, every gas lamp, every candle produced particles of combustion that settled continuously on every surface. The coal fires produced not only ash that drifted through the house, but also a fine greasy soot that clung to surfaces and was particularly noticeable on light-coloured walls and fabrics. Add to this the ordinary dust of daily life, dried skin cells, textile fibres, particles tracked in from outside, and you begin to understand why Victorian housekeeping was such a constant battle and why the dusting and cleaning of the reception rooms was never truly complete. It was a holding action, managed daily to maintain the appearance of cleanliness against a steady tide. Agnes worked through the rooms quickly, flicking her feather duster over the lighter surfaces and using a soft cloth for the more delicate items. By 7 o'clock she had moved on to the next phase of her morning, the carpets. There was no vacuum cleaner in this house in 1887. The carpet sweeper, a simple mechanical device with rotating brushes that had been available since the 1850s, was used for daily maintenance of the carpets, pushing loose dirt and dust toward the edges where it could be removed with a hand brush and dustpan, but this was not deep cleaning. The carpets in the main reception rooms were of good quality Brussels or Wilton weave, their patterns already doing much to hide the dirt, but over time the accumulation of dust in the fibres was considerable and produced a dullness that the family would notice. The deep cleaning of carpets was a periodic task rather than a daily one, and it involved rolling up the carpet, carrying it outside into the back garden or hanging it over a line, and beating it vigorously with a carpet beater, a flat oval frame of woven cane or twisted wire attached to a handle, designed to transmit sharp blows to the carpet's surface and knock the embedded dust and debris free in clouds. This was heavy, hot, unpleasant work, and it left the person doing it covered in dust. It was done room by room through the year, rotating through the house so that each carpet was beaten at least twice annually, more often for the most heavily used rooms. The care of furniture was its own specialization within housekeeping. Different surfaces required different treatments, and using the wrong one could cause lasting damage. The mahogany dining table was polished with a mixture of beeswax and turpentine, applied with a soft cloth, and then buffed vigorously to a deep shine. The upholstered furniture, the sofas and armchairs of the drawing room, the dining chairs with their padded seats, needed to be regularly brushed along the grain of the fabric to remove surface dust without flattening the pile. Wooden furniture throughout the house required regular waxing and polishing, and the smell of that wax, rich and faintly resinous, was one of the characteristic smells of a well-kept Victorian house. Add to it the smell of coal smoke, the smell of whatever was cooking in the kitchen below, the smell of cut flowers in the vases, and the faint lingering trace of the beeswax candles that were still burned in some rooms even in the gas era, and you have a particular sensory world that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who visited houses of this type. The windows were cleaned on a regular schedule, and this was a task that required care. Sash windows were cleaned from inside by lowering the top sash and raising the bottom one, then reversing the process, which allowed most of the glass to be reached without going outside. The outside of the upper story windows in a tall house was harder to access, and it was done with long-handled brushes and by the somewhat precarious method of leaning out from the window opening with a grip on the sash frame. Glass in this period was cleaned with a mixture that typically included vinegar and polished with old newspaper, which left a surprisingly streak-free finish and was cheap and constantly available in a household where newspapers came in daily. The grates and fireplaces needed constant attention beyond the daily laying and relaying of fires. Black leading, that process of applying and buffing graphite paste to the cast-iron surfaces of the grate, was done weekly rather than daily, but it had to be done well to preserve both the appearance and the function of the ironwork. Steel fenders, the decorative barriers at the front of the fireplace opening, required polishing with emery paper to maintain their bright finish. The chimney pieces themselves, the marble or stone surrounds and mantles, needed regular cleaning with a preparation appropriate to the stone, and the brass fire irons, the poker, the tongs, the small coal shovel, and the bellows that stood in their rack at the side of every fireplace, needed regular polishing with a paste of rotten stone and oil, applied with a leather cloth and buffed to brilliance. All of this was Agnes's world, or a significant part of it, and she had been at work for 2 hours by the time the family began to appear. The family's morning began quite differently. The master of the house, let us call him Mr. Ashworth, was woken at 7:30 by his valet, who entered quietly, drew back the curtains to admit whatever light the October morning was offering, placed a cup of tea on the bedside table, and laid out the morning's clothes. The valet's relationship with the master was one of intimate functional service. He knew exactly how the master preferred his shaving water. He knew which collar stud went with which shirt. He knew the difference between a morning at home and a morning requiring the formality of a frock coat rather than a morning coat, and he managed these details so smoothly that the master was largely able to proceed through the business of getting dressed without thinking about it. Dressing in the 1880s, for a man of the upper middle class, was a more complicated process than it sounds, though considerably less complicated than the equivalent process for a woman. The master's mourning required a clean shirt with its starched collar and cuffs, the stiff white linen that was one of the most visible signals of gentleman's status, and that required its own dedicated care in the laundry. Trousers, waistcoat, jacket, and the correct necktie tied in the correct knot for the occasion. Shoes were polished by the boot boy each morning and left outside the door. Gloves were checked to ensure they were clean. The appropriate hat was brushed and ready. Mrs. Ashworth's mourning was a considerably more elaborate affair. Her lady's maid, whose name was Parker, had been trained to a high standard in all the arts of personal service, including hairdressing, dressmaking repairs, the care of fine fabrics, and 1,000 small tasks that constituted the management of a Victorian upper-middle-class wardrobe. Parker would have laid out the mistress's morning dress the previous evening, checking it for any small repairs needed, and ensuring it was properly pressed. She woke Mrs. Ashworth at 8 o'clock with tea, opened the curtains, and prepared the dressing room while the mistress bathed or washed. The question of bathing is worth pausing on, because it illuminates something important about the household's infrastructure. Fixed bathtubs connected to a reliable supply of hot and cold running water were only beginning to appear in the most modern and well-equipped London houses in the 1880s. Many houses of the period still relied on the hip bath, a portable metal tub brought to the dressing room and filled with hot water carried up from the kitchen in large cans. This was not a minor operation. A single bath might require 8 or 10 cans of hot water, each weighing several pounds, carried from the basement kitchen to the upper floors. It was the housemaid's job to carry that water, and she managed it with the practiced efficiency of long experience, making multiple trips without complaining and without spilling. The empty cans then had to be taken back down again. Ashworth bathed perhaps twice a week in the colder months, and more frequently in summer, supplemented on other mornings by washing from the washstand, the ceramic bowl and ewer of water that stood on a marble-topped stand in every bedroom and dressing room. Parker managed all of this, ensuring that fresh water was available morning and evening, that used water was removed, and that the mistress's skin and hair received whatever treatments they required. She was also a skilled hairdresser. Victorian women's hairstyles of the 1880s, with their elaborate arrangements of waves and curls pinned into shapes that suggested effortless elegance, actually required considerable skill and time to achieve. Parker would dress Mrs. Ashworth's hair each morning, working quickly and confidently, knowing from years of experience exactly what the mistress wanted without needing to be told. And then came the dressing itself, and this is where things become genuinely remarkable to a modern understanding. The layers of a Victorian woman's dress were not simply layers of fabric, they were a structural system. At the foundation was the chemise, a loose shift of fine linen or cotton worn next to the skin. Over it came the stays, which in the 1880s meant a corset, a stiffened garment of heavy coutil fabric reinforced with whalebone or steel, lacing up the back and designed to mold the torso into the shape that fashion demanded. Getting into a properly fitted corset required assistance. The back lacing needed to be tightened evenly from bottom to top, and Parker would pull the laces firm while Mrs. Ashworth held onto the bedpost or a convenient piece of furniture. The degree of tightness varied by preference and by occasion, but the corset was non-negotiable as a garment. It was the structural foundation on which everything else was hung, and going without it would have been considered not merely improper, but actually uncomfortable, since Victorian women who wore corsets regularly found that their back muscles came to rely on the support. Over the corset came a corset cover, a simple garment to protect the outer clothes from the corset's boning. Then the petticoats, the number and type of which depended on the style of the outer skirt. In the 1880s, the bustle was at its second height, and the rear of a fashionable skirt projected backward in a shelf-like structure that required special petticoats and sometimes additional bustle supports to achieve its shape. Then stockings, held up by garters or by suspenders attached to the corset. Then the under petticoat of the outer dress. Then the bodice and skirt of the dress itself, which might have a dozen or more small buttons down the back, each one requiring to be fastened individually. Then a collar, perhaps separate, pinned in place. Then cuffs. Then whatever additional small accessories were appropriate to the hour and the day. A brooch, a small piece of jewellery, a belt if the silhouette required one. The whole process, from the moment Mrs. Ashworth sat down at her dressing table to the moment she descended the staircase for breakfast, took perhaps an hour. A hurried morning might compress it to 40 minutes, but there was no meaningfully fast way to dress, because the system did not allow for speed. The buttons required time. The corset lacing required time. The hair required time. Parker worked through it all with the smooth efficiency of a professional, anticipating each step, handing each garment at exactly the right moment, and the result, when Mrs. Ashworth descended to the morning room at 9 o'clock, was a woman who appeared to have arrived at her finished state without particular effort. That appearance of effortlessness was itself the achievement, and it had cost an hour of invisible labour to produce it. Breakfast at 9 o'clock, or perhaps 9:30 on mornings when the master had been at his club the previous evening and was moving more slowly. The dining room table was already laid, not by anyone who would be visible now. The footman who set the table had done so before the family came down, moving through the room with the practiced quiet of someone whose presence was not supposed to register. The sideboard held the covered silver dishes in which hot breakfast items were kept warm. Kedgeree, perhaps, this being a period when the Indian fish and rice dish was fashionable for breakfast in prosperous households. Bacon, kidneys, scrambled eggs, a small joint if the master was particularly hungry, cold ham, cold tongue, cold game pie if there was any remaining from the previous day, fresh rolls still warm from the kitchen, toast in a silver rack, butter, marmalade, honey, a coffee pot and a teapot both, because the family's preferences differed. The abundance of a Victorian breakfast sideboard strikes the modern eye as extraordinary, and it was extraordinary in terms of the labour required to produce it. The cook had been at work since before 6, and producing this spread represented several hours of preparation, but it also reflected a particular approach to meals that was quite different from the modern understanding. Breakfast was the meal that set the household going, and in a prosperous Victorian home it was never merely perfunctory. It was also practical in ways that we no longer think about. A day that might include a long ride or extended work in the estate, or a morning of meetings without a break required substantial fuel, and the Victorian breakfast provided it. There was no snacking culture, no convenience food available at every corner. You ate properly at the established meal times, or you did not eat. The family took their breakfast largely in silence or in brief domestic conversation, the master reading the morning papers, the mistress looking at the post, which had been sorted and placed on the table beside her cover by the footman. The children, if they breakfasted with their parents rather than in the nursery, sat quietly and ate what they were given. An air of unhurried calm presided over the room, maintained partly by disposition and partly by the fact that nothing in this room required urgent attention. The problems of the household were being managed elsewhere, quietly, by other people. After breakfast, the house separated into its working rhythms. The master might retreat to his library, or depart for his office, or his club, or whatever business occupied him outside the house. Mrs. Ashworth retired to the morning room to begin the work of the day that was specifically hers, the morning interview with the cook. This interview, called the giving of orders in the domestic vocabulary of the time, was one of the most important regular meetings in the household schedule, and one of the most revealing about how a Victorian upper-middle-class home actually functioned. Every morning, the cook came to the morning room at a fixed hour, usually between 9 and 10, and the mistress went over the day's menus with her. The word menus is slightly misleading in its modern ring. What was being decided was the full range of food that the house would produce that day. Not just dinner, but luncheon, tea, the meals of the servants' hall, whatever was to be baked or preserved or prepared for later use. The cook would advise on what was in the larder, what had been delivered that morning by the butcher and the greengrocer and the fishmonger, what was nearing the end of its good life and needed to be used promptly. The mistress would decide, taking into account whether guests were expected, what had been served at recent dinners, and her sense of the family's preferences and digestion. This morning consultation was where the mistress exercised her real domestic authority. She might defer to the cook's expertise on technique. She would not tell Mrs. Henderson how to make a sauce, but the overall decisions about what was served and when were hers, and those decisions had downstream consequences throughout the entire household for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, the housekeeper was conducting her own morning tour of the house, moving from room to room with the sharp eye of long experience, checking that the morning's work had been done properly, noting anything that needed attention, and making her own mental lists of the day's requirements. The housekeeper's daily tour was the quality control mechanism of the entire domestic operation. She checked that the grates had been properly cleaned and the fires properly laid. She checked that the surfaces had been dusted and the ornaments properly replaced. She noted any damage to fabrics or furniture. She assessed the general state of each room against the standard the family expected, and was not shy about communicating her findings to the housemaid responsible. The housekeeper also managed the household supplies, and this was an administrative task of considerable complexity. She kept a stock book, recording what came into and out of the household's stores of dry goods, cleaning materials, candles, household linens, and the hundreds of other items that a house of this size consumed. She managed the household accounts, not the general family finances, which were the master's domain, but the running costs of the house itself. She ordered supplies as needed, managing the relationships with the various tradespeople and ensuring that quality was maintained and that the household was not being overcharged. She was, in the modern understanding of the term, a logistics professional operating without the benefit of any of the tools that profession uses today. There is a particular quality to the management of a Victorian household that is easy to miss if you approach it only from the social history angle, focusing on the class dynamics and the conditions of service. The logistical reality was genuinely complex. A household of this size was essentially a small hotel, feeding 20 or 30 people 3 times a day, maintaining a building of considerable size in immaculate condition, managing fuel and water supply without automatic systems, and doing all of it in a social context that required everything to be done invisibly, silently, and without visible effort. The people who ran it well were running a complex organization, and they knew it, even if the language available to them for describing what they did was limited to the vocabulary of service. Let us move through the house and think about heating, because heating was one of the most labor-intensive and coal-consuming operations of the entire establishment. The physics of heating a Victorian mansion are worth understanding, because they explain so much about why the house was organized the way it was, and why heating it required such sustained effort. A Victorian townhouse, despite its imposing solidity, was in fact quite poorly insulated by modern standards. The walls, though thick, were solid brick or stone with no cavity and no insulation layer. Single-pane glass in the windows offered almost no resistance to heat loss. The tall ceilings that the Victorians considered essential to the dignity of a reception room meant that a great volume of heated air collected above the heads of the people in the room, while the floor level remained chilly. The fireplaces, for all their cheerful warmth, were remarkably inefficient heating devices, losing most of their heat up the chimney along with the smoke. A coal fire in a Victorian fireplace heated primarily by radiation. The glowing coals radiated heat outward into the room, warming surfaces and people that were directly in line of sight of the fire, but doing very little to warm the air in the rest of the room. Standing close to the fire was warm, sitting near the windows was cold. This was simply the reality of the technology, and Victorian interiors were arranged to manage it. The best seats, the ones nearest the fireplace, were occupied by the most important members of the household and their most honoured guests. The fireplace end of the drawing room was where the hostess sat with her principal guests. The fireside chair in the library was where the master spent his evenings. Cold drafts from the windows were managed with thick curtain linings, draft excluders along the bottom of doors, and the arrangement of heavy furniture as windbreaks. The cold of a Victorian winter interior, even a well-heated one, was not trivial. Water in the washstand basins froze overnight in bedrooms with unlit fireplaces during hard frosts. The marble halls of grand country houses were genuinely cold in January. The servants' bedrooms at the top of the house, the last to benefit from any warmth rising through the building, and the first to lose whatever warmth the day had provided, could be bitterly cold in winter. In houses where economy was practiced, the fires in bedrooms were lit only in the evening, an hour before the family retired, so that the room was warm for dressing and undressing, but not heated through the night. In the morning the fire would be relayed before the family woke, but in the interval between the fire going out overnight and being relit in the morning, the room cooled quickly. Coal consumption in a house of this size was substantial and represented a significant household expense. In a year with a long cold winter, a large Victorian townhouse might burn many tons of coal, not just in the kitchen range and the reception room fireplaces, but in bedroom fireplaces, the servants' hall, the bathroom if there was one, the various other services that required heat. The coal was delivered by horse-drawn coal wagon and tipped through a round iron cover in the pavement directly into the basement coal cellar, arriving in quantity perhaps once a month, or more frequently in winter. The carrying of coal from the cellar to the various fires throughout the house was one of the constant physical tasks of the housemaids and the hallboy, who made dozens of trips daily carrying the heavy iron scuttles that held perhaps 20 pounds of coal each. A coal scuttle carried up 3 flights of stairs to a bedroom fireplace, then emptied, then carried back down again, then refilled from the cellar, then carried up again. This circuit was repeated so many times each day across the whole house that the aggregate physical labour involved was genuinely formidable. The hallboy, usually the most junior male servant and often a teenager in his first position, might carry coal for half of every working day. The housemaid responsible for the upper floors would do the same, and this was not counted as unusual or particularly heavy work in the domestic vocabulary of the time. It was simply the requirement of keeping the house warm. The kitchen range was in its own category of coal consumption and management. The range was the technological centre of the Victorian domestic kitchen, and understanding it is essential to understanding the kitchen's entire operation. A Victorian kitchen range was a massive cast-iron structure built into what had originally been the kitchen fireplace opening. It typically incorporated a central fire chamber with an open grate for cooking directly over the fire, an oven on one side heated by the fire chamber through a system of flues, a second smaller oven on the other side, often used for slower cooking or keeping things warm, a hot water tank or boiler at the back, and a flat iron hot plate above the fire that provided a range of temperatures from fiercely hot directly above the coals to merely warm at the far edges. The entire structure was perhaps 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep and stood waist high, its black surfaces radiating heat into the kitchen even in summer. The range was lit at 5:30 or 6 in the morning and would not go fully out until late evening, after supper had been served and the kitchen cleared. Even then, the overnight banking of coals preserved live embers that made relighting easier in the morning. The cook managed the range's temperatures with skill developed over years. She knew by the colour and sound of the fire when the oven had reached bread baking temperature, when it was hot enough for pastry but too hot for a long braise, when the hot plate was at the right temperature for a delicate sauce versus a straightforward boil. There were no thermometers, no dials, no settings. The cook's judgment was the thermostat. The kitchen in a house of this size was not a single room but a department, and its operation was strikingly complex. The cook herself was responsible for the family's meals. She was assisted by the kitchen maid, whose job encompassed all the preparation work that preceded the actual cooking, peeling and chopping vegetables, preparing stocks and sauces, boning and trussing meat, and the endless washing of pots and pans. The scullery maid was below the kitchen maid in the hierarchy and occupied herself with the heaviest and most unpleasant cleaning work, washing the large pots and roasting pans that the kitchen produced in quantity, scrubbing the kitchen tables, cleaning the kitchen floor, and performing whatever other dirty jobs were assigned to her. The scullery was her domain, adjacent to the kitchen, steam-filled and perpetually smelling of soap and grease and hot water. The work of the kitchen divided roughly into 3 overlapping cycles: the immediate work of producing the current meal, the preparation work for the next meal, and the ongoing production of preserved and stored foods that required a cook's time and skills but were not consumed immediately. Jams, pickles, and preserved fruits were made in season and stored in the housekeeper's room, or the still room. Stocks were made from the bones of yesterday's roast and used as the foundation of today's sauces. Yesterday's bread was set aside for bread sauce or for the servants' hall. Nothing was wasted that could be used. The meals themselves need some explanation, because the Victorian approach to formal feeding was quite different from modern practice and considerably more elaborate. The Victorian upper-middle-class family ate, on an ordinary day, 3 main meals plus afternoon tea. Breakfast we have already seen. Luncheon, at 1 or 1:30, was a lighter meal typically taken only by the mistress, the children, and any visitors present, since the master was often away at his business or club. It might consist of cold meats and salads, a hot dish or two, and a pudding. Simple by the household standards, but still a proper meal requiring proper service. Afternoon tea at 5 o'clock was served in the drawing room, and was not the modest cup and biscuit affair we might imagine. Victorian afternoon tea was a proper event, particularly if callers were expected. The footman brought the tea tray, which held the silver teapot and the hot water jug and the milk and sugar, along with a tiered cake stand bearing small sandwiches, cucumber perhaps, or potted meat, the crusts removed and the bread buttered, and a selection of small cakes and pastries that the cook had produced that afternoon. The making of these small cakes and pastries was one of the tasks that filled the kitchen's afternoon, alongside the preparation of dinner. Dinner was the great set piece of the Victorian household's culinary day. In a household of this standing, dinner was served at 7:30 or 8 in the evening, and was a formal meal even when the family was dining alone, with the full service and the full number of courses. When guests were invited, and this house entertained regularly, because entertaining was itself a form of social currency, dinner became a production of considerable complexity. A formal Victorian dinner in the à la Russe style that had become fashionable by the 1880s was served as a sequence of individual courses, each presented separately and removed before the next appeared. A formal dinner menu of the period might include soup, either clear consommé or a cream soup, fish, perhaps turbot with a beurre blanc, or salmon with cucumber sauce, an entree, a small hot dish that served as a kind of intermediate course, perhaps a sweetbread preparation or a vol au vent, the main course, or removes, a large joint of roasted meat carved at the sideboard, game if the season was right, roasted and served with traditional accompaniments, vegetables and potatoes, which in the formal service came as side dishes rather than as part of the main plate, a sorbet to clear the palate between the meat courses, a second entree, then the sweets, perhaps a cold dessert, a hot pudding, an iced confection, then cheese and biscuits, then fruit and nuts. Meal nanda men. This is 8 or 9 courses, produced entirely by hand on a coal-fired range, timed to appear at the table in perfect sequence and at perfect temperature, in a kitchen where the oven temperature was judged by feel and the timing by experience, served by footmen who moved between the kitchen and dining room in a precisely choreographed relay, and consumed in a room where the conversation was expected to be brilliant and the wine service impeccable, and the whole atmosphere calculated to suggest that this degree of abundance and perfection was simply how things naturally were in this house. The logistics of producing a formal Victorian dinner for 12 or 14 guests were remarkable. The cook would have been planning for it 2 or 3 days in advance, placing orders with the tradespeople, checking the larder, thinking through the sequence of preparations. The morning of the dinner was devoted primarily to preparation, making the stocks and sauces that formed the foundation of most of the dishes, preparing the pastry for the tarts and vol au vents that needed time to chill, beginning the long, slow braising processes that needed hours on the range. The afternoon accelerated into the busy final preparations. By 5 o'clock the kitchen would be operating at full intensity, with the cook managing multiple processes simultaneously, roasting at one temperature, braising at another, finishing sauces on the hot plate, checking the oven temperature with her hand, while the kitchen maid worked beside her and the scullery maid cleaned behind them in a continuous cycle. The food came together in the kitchen, but getting it to the table required its own coordinated operation. The butler was in command of the dining room and the service. He had spent the afternoon polishing the silver, real silver, in a household of this standing, not plate, and arranging the table with an attention to geometry that would not have been out of place in a military operation. The tablecloth was laid dead straight. The place settings were positioned at exact intervals, each one identical to its neighbours. The glasses were grouped in the precise pattern required for the wines that would be served. The floral centrepiece, arranged by the mistress or the head gardener depending on the household's custom, was positioned symmetrically between the candelabra. The silver candlesticks held new candles of exactly equal length. The footmen, in their livery, had been briefed by the butler on the dinner's sequence and their individual responsibilities. Each footman was assigned specific guests to serve. In a well-run household, the number of guests on each footman's side was calculated so that service proceeded at the same pace around the entire table. They had rehearsed the carrying of dishes, the pouring of wine, the synchronization of service so that each course appeared and was removed simultaneously around the full table, without any guest having to wait while their neighbour was served. When the guests arrived, at 7:30 or 8, their carriages or cabs drawing up to the front door, the footman opening the carriage door and the butler receiving them in the hall, the performance began. The guests were shown upstairs to leave their outer wraps. They descended to the drawing room for the pre-dinner period of sherry or Madeira and conversation, during which the butler circulated with quiet efficiency and the footmen stood at attention near the doors. When dinner was announced, the party moved to the dining room in order of precedence, the guest of highest social rank escorted by the host, the hostess escorted by the second-ranking gentleman, and so on down the table. The dinner proceeded. The soup appeared, steam rising from the tureen as the footman carried it to the sideboard. The butler ladled it at the sideboard and handed the filled plates to the footman who placed them before the guests. The fish arrived on a great platter. The removes were carved at the sideboard. The sauces were offered in their boats. The wines came in sequence, hock with the fish perhaps, a claret with the meat, a sweet sauternes with the pudding, champagne at intervals throughout. The conversation around the table was conducted at sufficient volume to be animated but never loud, and it varied between general exchanges that included the whole table and smaller conversations between seated neighbours. And in the kitchen below, the cook and her assistants worked in a sustained, furious rhythm, the heat of the range and the concentrated effort of production turning the kitchen into a place of considerable intensity. The timing had to be perfect. A dish held too long waiting for its moment would spoil or lose its character. A dish dispatched before the previous course had been properly finished would pile up in the dining room's staging area and arrive at the table cold. The relay between kitchen and dining room, managed by the butler with messages passed through the footman and the speaking tube if the house had one, was a logistical operation conducted in real time. After the dessert, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, while the gentlemen remained at the table for port and conversation. This separation was standard practice and served several functions. It gave the gentlemen license for the kind of direct political and business conversation that was not considered suitable for mixed company. It allowed the ladies to repair any damage to their toilette after the long meal and to have their own conversations without the requirement of mixed company manners, and it provided the kitchen with a useful interval in which to complete the final preparations for the dessert service. After perhaps half an hour, the gentlemen joined the ladies in the drawing room, and the evening proceeded with conversation and music until the guests began to make their departures at 11 or so. The clearing of the dining room after a formal dinner was itself a substantial operation. The silver had to be collected, counted, washed in special soap to preserve its finish, dried, and returned to the butler's pantry for storage. The glasses, which were of fine crystal, required careful hand-washing. The tablecloth, which was damask linen and represented considerable value, was inspected for stains, wine stains treated immediately with cold water and salt, gravy stains with cold water, anything else noted for the laundry's special attention. The crockery was taken to the scullery, the dining room was cleared and tidied, and the butler, last to leave the room, extinguished the candles or turned down the gas and checked that the fireplace screen was properly in place against the danger of any stray coal falling from the grate overnight. By midnight, or perhaps 1 in the morning after a late dinner party, the house was at last quieting towards sleep, but there were still final duties to perform before the first members of the household could retire.
The most important of these was the locking of the house.
This was not a trivial responsibility in Victorian London. Burglary was a real concern, and a house of this size, known to contain valuable silver, jewellery, and other portable valuables, was a potential target. The butler made a final circuit of the house before retiring, checking that every ground floor window was secured, that every door was locked or bolted, and that the plate, the household silver, was locked in its case in the butler's pantry. He checked the kitchen to ensure that the range had been properly banked, and that there was no risk of fire from a forgotten coal. He walked through the reception rooms, noting any small maintenance issues that needed attention the following morning, and checked that the gas supply was properly regulated. In houses that used gas lighting, and by the 1880s most London townhouses of any pretension had at least partial gas lighting in the main reception rooms, Managing the gas supply at night was a specific responsibility. Each gas fitting had to be turned off at the wall plate, not simply at the burner, and the main supply needed to be checked to ensure there was no ongoing leak. Gas was not without hazard. An undetected leak could fill a room with an invisible, odorless at the time, before odorants were added to gas supplies, that could ignite or asphyxiate. The butler was responsible for ensuring that all gas fittings were properly secured each night. The footmen, who had been on duty since before dinner, were the next to be released. The hallboy checked and relocked the back door and the area gate. Agnes and the other housemaids, who had worked since 5:30 in the morning and had their own evening duties attending to the family's bedrooms and preparing them for the night, were among the last of the female staff to finish. The evening bedroom routine was a mirror of the morning one. Agnes moved through the upper floors, turning down the beds, folding back the covers to the foot of the bed in the proper V-shape, placing the nightclothes ready, ensuring that the fire in each occupied bedroom was burning properly, filling the water ewer, placing a covered warming pan briefly under the sheets in cold weather to take off the chill, and checking that everything was in order for the family's retirement. Parker attended to Mrs. Ashworth in her dressing room for the evening undressing, a process that reversed the morning's layers in the same careful sequence, unhooking the dress, unlacing the corset, brushing out and plaiting the hair for the night, applying whatever creams or preparations were the mistress's nighttime routine. The evening undressing was an intimate, quiet operation conducted in the warmth of the dressing room, and there was often more conversation between mistress and maid during these evening rituals than at any other time of day, because the formality of the household was somewhat suspended, and the mistress could speak more freely than she could in company. Parker heard things about the dinner party guests, about social events, about family concerns that were never discussed in any other setting. She listened, responded when invited to, and kept what she heard entirely to herself. Discretion was one of the most prized qualities a lady's maid could possess, and Parker had been with Mrs. Ashworth long enough that the relationship between them had developed a warmth that transcended the formal categories of service. The last member of the household to take to her bed was often the housekeeper. She made her own final circuit, checking that the housemaids had completed their evening duties properly, that the fires were safe, that the house was secure and in order. She wrote up her notes for the next day's housekeeping in the quiet of her room, listing what needed to be done, what supplies needed ordering, what repairs needed organizing, and then she extinguished her candle, and the house settled fully into its nighttime quiet. Somewhere in the dark at the top of the house, Agnes was already asleep, exhausted in the productive, untroubled way of someone who has used their body hard for many hours. In the kitchen, the range ticked and muttered quietly to itself, its banked coals holding their heat through the night. In the butler's pantry, the locked case of silver held its contents in the dark. In the cellar, bottles of claret from the dinner lay in their racks. Outside, the frost was hardening on the pavement, and the gas lamps were burning through toward dawn. In 6 hours, Agnes would be up again. Now let us go more carefully through some of the household's specific operations, because each of them reveals another layer of this extraordinary world. Let us begin with laundry. Laundry in a Victorian mansion was not a chore. It was an ordeal, conducted on a semi-industrial scale, and it was one of the most physically demanding operations in the entire household's week. The sheer volume of fabric that a large Victorian household produced in the normal course of daily life was staggering. Table linens alone, the long damask tablecloths for the dining room, the smaller linen cloths for luncheon, the napkins, the sideboard cloths, the tray cloths, ran to dozens of pieces in regular use. Bed linens in a house with many beds meant dozens of sheets and pillowcases, changed weekly. The family's personal laundry included shirts with their starched collars and cuffs, and the starch and the ironing of shirts was an art form in itself. Undergarments, nightclothes, handkerchiefs in quantity, ladies' petticoats and chemises, and various delicate items. The servants' uniforms had to be washed. Tea towels, kitchen cloths, cleaning rags, everything needed washing, and washing happened once a week on a fixed day. Monday was washing day in most Victorian households, and the preparations for it began on Sunday, when the laundry maids sorted and soaked the items that needed the longest treatment. The washing was done in the laundry, which in a large house was a dedicated room, separate from the kitchen, with its own large copper, a fixed metal tub set over a fireplace or range, and a set of wooden wash tubs, a mangle, and a drying area. In a London townhouse without extensive garden space, the drying might happen on lines strung in the basement area or in a small backyard, or in some arrangements the laundry was sent out to commercial laundresses who returned it clean and pressed. But in houses that maintained an in-house laundry, the process was entirely manual and entirely exhausting. The washing copper was filled with water and heated until boiling. This alone required significant time and fuel. White cotton and linen items, the shirts, the tablecloths, the household linens, went into the boiling copper with soap and washing soda, which cut through grease and helped lift stains. The boiling itself lasted perhaps half an hour, the items being stirred with a long wooden dolly, sometimes called a dolly peg, to ensure even treatment. After boiling, they were lifted out, scalding hot and heavy with water, with wooden tongs or a copper stick, and transferred to the first wash tub for actual scrubbing. The rubbing board, corrugated metal or glass set in a wooden frame, was used to work the soap through the fabric on any particularly soiled areas, collars, cuffs, any stains that had been spotted during sorting. This scrubbing was hard on the hands, the washing soda was caustic, the water hot, and the repeated wringing and scrubbing over hours left the hands of laundry workers red, raw and rough. After scrubbing, each item was wrung out by hand, an arm-tiring process for heavy items like sheets, which absorbed enormous amounts of water, and then transferred to the second tub for rinsing in clean water, then wrung again, transferred to a third tub, rinsed again. Clean water was essential for good results. Items left with soap residue in the fibers would look dull when dry and feel stiff against the skin. Some households added a little blue rinse. Reckitt's Blue was the common brand, a small packet dissolved in the final rinse water, which counteracted the slight yellowing that white fabrics developed through repeated washing and gave linen a bright bluish-white appearance that was considered the mark of excellent laundry. After the final rinse, items went through the mangle, which was a large device with two heavy rollers through which the fabric was fed to squeeze out the excess water. A proper household mangle was a substantial piece of equipment, perhaps 4 feet wide with cast iron rollers, and operating it required turning a handle to force the fabric through the rollers while maintaining even tension. The mangle did not fully dry the fabric. It simply removed enough water that drying could proceed more quickly. The wrung items were then carried to wherever drying was done, outdoors if the weather permitted, which in England was not always the case, or in the drying room if the house had one, or draped over the kitchen range's overhead drying rack, a hinged wooden frame that could be raised to catch the warm air rising from the range. Coloured fabrics required different treatment from whites because the alkaline washing soda could fade or damage vegetable dyes. Woolen items required cold water and gentle treatment, since hot water would cause them to shrink and felt. Silk required special treatment with soap flakes in lukewarm water. A Victorian laundry worker needed to know the properties of every type of fabric she was likely to handle, and the house's laundry contained examples of most of them. Then came starching and ironing, which was perhaps the most skilled part of the entire laundry operation, and certainly the most time-consuming. Starching was applied to the items that needed it, principally the linen tablecloths and napkins, and the white shirt fronts and cuffs and collars, by mixing cooked starch to the right consistency and applying it evenly before ironing. Too little starch produced a limp result. Too much produced a rigid, board-like stiffness. The right amount produced the crisp, bright finish that was expected of fine household linen and was one of the visible marks of a well-run establishment. The irons were heated on the kitchen range or on a special iron heating device. There were no thermostats, no temperature settings. The laundress judged the temperature of the iron by holding it near her cheek to feel the radiated heat, or by spitting briefly on the sole plate and listening to how quickly the spit evaporated, a technique that worked perfectly well for an experienced ironer who had done it thousands of times. The irons were heavy, cast iron implements that cooled as you worked and needed to be returned to the heat every few minutes to maintain their working temperature, which meant that the laundress was managing a rotation of irons, one in use, one on the range reheating, another waiting in line. Ironing a formal Victorian tablecloth for the dining room was a task requiring both skill and time. The cloth was long, perhaps 4 yards or more, and wide, and it had to be ironed in sections, moving systematically from one end to the other, while keeping the ironed sections from becoming re-wrinkled as the cloth was repositioned. A plain cotton sheet was manageable. A damask tablecloth, with its woven pattern of flowers or geometric forms that were visible only in certain light when the cloth was perfectly pressed, required precise ironing to preserve the texture of the weave without pressing it flat. The ironed cloth had to be folded and stored carefully so that the ironed creases fell in exactly the right places when the cloth was spread on the table. The shirt, with its stiff detachable collar and cuffs, was its own challenge. The collar had to be starched to a specific degree of stiffness, firm enough to stand up properly, not so rigid that it was uncomfortable, and ironed with careful attention to the points and the band. The shirt front, if it was one of the pleated or frilled fronts that were fashionable in formal dress, required ironing along each pleat individually, a process that took considerable time. The cuffs needed precise, sharp edges. All of this was done by hand, in the heat of the laundry, for perhaps 50 or 60 shirts a week in a large household with numerous male family members and staff requiring clean shirts. The laundry also repaired as it washed. Small tears were mended, buttons that had come loose were re-sewn, worn edges were turned before they gave way entirely. Household linen was expensive and was expected to last for years or decades with proper care. A set of fine damask table linen was an investment, passed down through generations. The laundry's job was not simply to clean it, but to preserve it. The physical toll of laundry work on the women who did it was considerable. Hours of standing over hot water and a hot range, repeated wringing of heavy wet fabric, lifting and carrying water in large quantities, the chemical irritation of soap and soda on the hands. Laundry was consistently described in contemporary accounts of domestic service as one of the hardest of all the house's tasks. Laundry maids were generally the most junior of the female domestic staff, often the youngest women in the household, and the physical demands of the work were such that it was understood as a young person's labour. There is something in the laundry that concentrates all of the Victorian household's essential qualities, a combination of high standards and invisible effort, the physical reality of work that never showed on the finished surface, the skill required to achieve what appeared effortless. When the damask tablecloth lay flat and gleaming on the dining room table and the napkins stood in their crisp folds beside each plate, the 10 or 12 hours of labour that had produced that appearance was entirely invisible. That invisibility was the point. Let us leave the laundry and move upward through the house, because there are rooms we have not yet visited properly, and each of them has its own character and its own stories. The library occupied the ground floor on the quieter side of the house, away from the street. It was a room of deliberate solidity, dark mahogany bookcases built into 3 of the 4 walls from floor to ceiling, a rolling library ladder to reach the upper shelves, a large partner's desk positioned to catch the best of the window light, leather-covered chairs in deep green and burgundy, a fireplace with a carved stone mantel. The smell of the room was its own particular combination: old leather, pipe tobacco, book paper, the faint smell of the polish that Agnes used on the desk, and the occasional scent of wood smoke from the fire. It was a room designed for a specific kind of serious leisure. The master's books were not simply decorative, they were actually read. Mr. Ashworth was a man of business, perhaps a successful lawyer, perhaps a merchant in one of the city's great firms, but he was also a man of the broad general culture that educated Victorian men were expected to maintain. He read the serious periodicals, the reviews, the works of history and natural science that the age was producing in such quantity. His bookshelves held sets of standard authors, the complete works of Gibbon, of Macaulay, of Dickens and Thackeray, alongside more specialized volumes relating to his professional and personal interests. The current novel from Moody's Lending Library sat in the reading stand beside his chair. The morning room, by contrast, was entirely Mrs. Ashworth's territory. Its colours were lighter, pale walls, curtains in soft gold, comfortable chairs upholstered in striped silk, and its atmosphere was one of managed sociability. This was where morning visits were received. The custom of the morning call, which was one of the defining social rituals of Victorian upper-middle-class life, meant that on most mornings there would be 1 or 2 or 3 visitors arriving between 11 and 1 o'clock, each one making a visit of the prescribed 15 to 20 minutes, sitting in the chair beside Mrs. Ashworth's own, drinking the tea that the footman brought, exchanging the news of the social world, and departing with a card left in the silver tray by the door. The morning call was not, as modern sensibility might suppose, a frivolous activity. It was a form of social maintenance essential to the household's position. The network of calls and returns of calls, of invitations sent and received, of social intelligence gathered and processed in the morning room, was the mechanism by which the family sustained its place in the social world. An invitation to dinner depended on these calls, a connection that might benefit the master's business, a match that might suit one of the children, a charitable association that could open certain doors. All of these things were managed through the social web that the morning room maintained. Mrs. Ashworth received with an easy graciousness that was itself a considerable skill. She remembered details about every caller's family, health and circumstances. She navigated the complex hierarchies of the social world, who could be introduced to whom, which visits required reciprocation within what time frame, whose feelings needed particular management, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it since her own debut. She also managed the household's social diary, keeping track of every invitation, every engagement, every call owed and call received. She communicated her wishes to the housekeeper, who communicated them down the chain to wherever in the house they needed to be implemented. The drawing room was used in the evening, for the period after dinner when the ladies withdrew, and for afternoon tea when callers were expected. It was the grandest room in the house, and it was treated accordingly. Agnes, who was responsible for it, approached it with a different quality of attention than she brought to the more workaday rooms. The drawing room had the best things in it, the best china, the best silver, the family's most valuable paintings, the finest furniture, and it required not only cleaning, but what might be called curating. The arrangement of objects was the mistress's, but maintaining that arrangement, restoring it after any disturbance, was Agnes's responsibility. She could set down a figurine in exactly the position it had occupied for the past 5 years, simply from long habit and precise observation. The piano occupied one corner of the drawing room, a rosewood upright with a silk-lined front panel, and Mrs. Ashworth's eldest daughter played it with some accomplishment. Practice happened in the drawing room on those mornings when the room was not in use for calls, the sound of scales and pieces rising through the house and reaching the servants' stairs as a thin, pleasant background to the morning's work. Music was considered an essential accomplishment for young women of the family's position, alongside French, drawing, and the various domestic arts. The daughter had a music teacher who came twice weekly, and on those afternoons the drawing room was surrendered to the lesson, and the rest of the house arranged its activities accordingly. The dining room requires more time, because it was used differently from all the other rooms, and its daily rhythm was distinctly its own. Between meals it sat in a particular state of readiness, the table cleared and polished, the sideboard set with the items that remained on permanent display there, the curtains half drawn to protect the furnishings from direct sunlight. The footman's morning duty included polishing the dining room silver that would be used that day, a task done in the butler's pantry and brought through to the dining room when complete. The table was relaid each meal, the cloth changed daily, the positions adjusted for whatever number of people would be eating. The dining room, perhaps more than any other room in the house, embodied the Victorian idea that appearance required constant work. The gleaming table, the perfect place settings, the sideboard arranged with its decanters and epergnes, all of this was the product of daily effort that was entirely invisible when seen from the perspective of the family seated for dinner. The butler moved through the dining room like a conductor managing a performance whose score he had memorized long ago. He knew exactly how the decanters should stand in relation to each other. He knew which glasses went in which grouping. He knew the height at which the candles should be positioned in the candelabra for optimal light without heat affecting the food. These were not arbitrary preferences. They were aesthetic judgments developed through years of experience and refined by the standards of each household he had served. The Victorian bedroom, which we have touched on from the perspective of the morning and evening routines, was in itself a fascinating and comfortable space by the standards of the time, at least at this level of the household. The masters' and mistresses' rooms occupied the best position on the first floor, facing the back garden for relative quiet. Each was a good-sized room, the masters furnished in a more masculine mode with darker fabrics and solid furniture, the mistresses lighter and more delicate in feeling. The beds were spectacular pieces of furniture, tall wooden or brass-framed structures with carved headboards, hung in some cases with fabric from a canopy and made up with considerable care. The under-mattress was a wool-stuffed or horsehair mattress placed directly on the bed frame's base. Over it came a feather mattress, softer and warmer, and over that the undersheet, then the upper sheet, then blankets, then a heavy bed cover or counterpane that served both as insulation and as the visible surface of the bed during the day. The bed cover in Mrs. Ashworth's room was quilted silk in a soft gold that matched the curtains. In the master's room it was plain white linen, heavy and smooth. Agnes made the beds each morning after the family had risen, a process that required stripping the entire bed, checking and turning the mattresses, remaking them with fresh linen, and replaced items in the exact sequence and to the exact smoothness that the housekeeper expected. The corners of the sheets at the foot of the bed were folded in a specific way, the envelope corner, or hospital corner in modern terms, that kept the sheets perfectly smooth and taut through the night. The pillows were arranged at the head of the bed in a precisely specified stack. The counterpane was spread and smoothed until not a single wrinkle was visible. A guest bed that had never been slept in, and a bed in daily use should, when Agnes was finished, look identical to the untrained eye. Zoud Arnight, Archie Dai, Kdoundusmingera. Ashworth's domain in the morning, the master's in the evening, and Parker maintained it with the attention to detail that applied to every space directly connected with the mistress's personal life. The dressing table, with its 3-panel mirror and its array of crystal and silver toilet accessories, the brushes and combs and hand mirror, the powder boxes and perfume bottles and pin tray, was arranged with an order that was simultaneously decorative and functional. Everything had its place. Parker could lay her hand on any item in the dark. The wardrobe and the press held the mistress's clothes in a system of organization that only Parker fully understood, though she could have described its logic to any interested party. The dresses arranged by season and occasion, the accessories organized to correspond, everything maintained in a state of readiness so that any requirement of dress could be met within minutes. Adjoining the dressing room was the bathroom, if the house had converted to fixed plumbing, which by the late 1880s was increasingly common in new or newly renovated London townhouses. The Victorian bathroom was not what the word suggests to modern sensibility. It was not necessarily a room of comfort or pleasure. It was functional and often slightly stark. A cast-iron bath on claw-footed legs, a washstand with a ceramic basin, hot and cold taps if the plumbing had been installed, linoleum or encaustic tile on the floor for practicality. The supply of hot water depended on a boiler in the basement, which required its own coal fire and constant management. In winter, the bathroom was among the coldest rooms in the house, requiring the fire to be lit specifically before bathing was contemplated, and even then the cold radiating from the walls and the floor meant that bathing was a relatively brisk affair rather than a prolonged luxury. There were also the water closets, which by the 1880s had replaced or supplemented the earlier system of chamber pots for most prosperous London households. Victorian sanitary plumbing was an area of active improvement and some anxiety throughout the second half of the 19th century, as the connection between sewage contamination and disease became better understood. The installation of proper water closets with effective water seals was considered one of the important household improvements of the age, and households that had made the conversion were proud of their modern arrangements. The design of Victorian water closets varied considerably. Some were fitted with elaborate decorative ceramics, transfer printed with blue and white pastoral scenes or floral designs, while others were plain white or cream, with polished mahogany seats and solid brass fittings. The maintenance of these fittings, the brass cleaned and polished, the ceramic scrubbed, the wooden seat treated against moisture, was another of the housemaid's daily tasks. The nursery floor deserves attention of its own, because it was, in many ways, the most human and the most complicated floor in the house to manage. Victorian attitudes toward children were in a state of slow transition during this period. The older view, which still had currency among more conservative families, held that children required strict discipline, limited indulgence, and early habituation to the demands of adult life. The newer view, influenced by the educational philosophy of Froebel and by the emerging field of child psychology, held that childhood was a special state deserving of particular care and that play and exploration were essential to development. Most Victorian upper-middle-class families navigated between these positions according to their own dispositions, the personalities of their children, and the character of the nurse who managed the day-to-day nursery life. The nurse was a figure of considerable importance in the household. She had more direct daily contact with the children than their parents did, and her influence on their character, habits, and basic happiness was proportionally great. A good nurse, warm and firm and patient and imaginative, could make a child's early years genuinely happy even within the confined world of the nursery. A poor one, rigid and cold and unimaginative, could make those same years a grim exercise in endurance. The nurse answered to the housekeeper for housekeeping matters and to the mistress on questions of the children's care and schedule, but within the nursery's walls she had an authority that was largely her own. The day nursery was a bright, warm room, deliberately appointed for the needs of children rather than the social requirements of the household. Toys, though the word covers everything from complex mechanical constructions to simple wooden blocks, occupied particular shelves and boxes. A rocking horse stood in one corner. There was a large toy cupboard whose contents were regulated by the nurse according to what she thought appropriate for the children's development and what was safe for the younger ones. The schoolroom, adjacent to the nursery in a well-organized house, was where the older children had their lessons with the governess, and its atmosphere was more regulated and academic. A plain desk and chair for each child, a blackboard, maps on the walls, the standard primers and grammar books, and arithmetic exercises. The evening nursery routine, when the children were bathed and prepared for bed, was one of the cozier parts of the household's daily rhythm. The nursery fire burned brightly in cold weather, and the nurse moved efficiently between the children. Perhaps there were 3 or 4, ranging in age from 2 to 10, bathing the younger ones in the large tin bath brought to the hearthrug for the purpose, overseeing the older ones washing, helping with the nightclothes, hearing the prayers that every Victorian child was expected to say before sleep, and settling each one into bed with whatever degree of storytelling and tucking in each child required. The bedtime story was not, in the Victorian nursery, necessarily the gentle affair it might be today. Nurse might read from one of the improving collections of tales for children that the period produced in quantity, some of which included a surprising degree of violence and consequence. Stories of disobedient children meeting sad ends were not unusual. She might tell from memory the tales she had heard in her own childhood. She might, if she was talented in this direction, make things up. The point was not necessarily to soothe the children to sleep. The Victorian approach to children's bedtime was more functional than that, but to signal the transition to nighttime and to manage the several children simultaneously through the process of settling down. Outside, while all of this was going on inside, there was the garden and the mews, which formed a whole other world of outdoor service that is easy to overlook when tracing the interior life of the house. A London townhouse of this type would have a garden at the back, not large typically, but tended with genuine care. The head gardener, if the garden was significant enough to merit one, was a specialist in his own right, managing the annual cycle of planting and maintenance that kept the garden presentable through the year. In winter his work focused on structural tidying and preparation, cutting back, mulching, planning for the following season. In spring and summer the work intensified with planting, training, watering, and the production of cut flowers for the house, the fresh flowers that appeared in the hall, on the dining table, in the drawing room, throughout the warmer months were grown and cut and arranged as a regular part of the household's provision. The Woo's house, at the back of the property, or along the service lane behind the terrace, housed the horses and the carriages. The coachman was responsible for the horses' daily care, the maintenance of the harness and the carriages, and the driving of the family wherever they needed to go. The horses were fed and groomed morning and evening. The carriages were kept clean and polished. The harness was checked and maintained. A carriage and pair that arrived at a dinner party, dirty, or with a harness in poor repair, was as much a reflection on the household as a poorly set table, and the coachman knew it. In a wealthy household there might also be a groom, a separate position from the coachman, whose primary responsibility was the riding horses if the family kept any, and perhaps a stable boy to do the rough work. The relationship between the indoor staff and the outdoor staff was sometimes a complicated one. They were subject to different authorities, the indoor staff to the butler and housekeeper, the outdoor staff ultimately to the master, and their spheres rarely overlapped except at the service entrance to the house, where deliveries came in and outdoor work equipment was stored. There was a degree of mutual curiosity and occasional tension between these two worlds within the same property, managed in most cases by a practical mutual respect born of the recognition that both sets of work were necessary to the household's overall function. One of the outdoor staff's responsibilities that did bridge the indoor and outdoor worlds was the fuel supply. The coal cellar we have already discussed, but there was also firewood used for the kitchen range's start-up fires and for the smaller fires in summer rooms, and kindling cut from waste wood, and the ash from all the fires that needed to be collected and disposed of. The management of fuel came in and the ash went out through the service entrance, bypassing the household's visible face entirely, managed by people whose names the guests would never know. Let us think now about lighting in greater detail, because the management of light in a Victorian mansion was a topic of considerable practical importance that touched every part of the household's operation. By the 1880s, a well-appointed London townhouse had gas lighting in its principal rooms. The installation of gas piping through the house, with its network of copper pipes and the various types of gas fittings that connected to them, was a significant infrastructure investment, and many houses had made it only partially. The drawing room, dining room, library, hall, and major guest rooms might be gas-lit, while bedrooms, servants' rooms, and secondary spaces continued to use oil lamps or candles. The gas mantles of this period, the Welsbach incandescent mantle, had only been introduced in 1885 and was still being adopted, produced a steady, yellowish-white light that was considerably brighter than either candle or oil lamp flame, and did not require the constant attention that oil lamps needed. A gas fitting with a clean chimney and an adjusted burner could be left to burn without intervention for hours. This represented a genuine practical improvement over the earlier technology, and the households that had it were aware of the advantage. But gas had its own management requirements. The gas fittings needed regular cleaning. The glass chimneys became clouded with deposits from the burning gas. The burners needed occasional attention to ensure they were drawing correctly, and the fittings themselves required polishing to maintain their appearance. The lamp room, in houses that used oil lamps or candles in addition to or instead of gas, was a significant operation. Oil lamps of the Argand or Corsert design, used during earlier decades of the century, required daily attention, trimming the wick to the correct length, cleaning the glass chimney, refilling the oil reservoir. A house with 20 oil lamps required someone to spend a significant part of each morning in the lamp room, attending to each one. Candles, which persisted in use even after the widespread adoption of gas, required their own management. The silver candlesticks that graced the dining table and the mantelpieces needed new candles installed before each use. The stubs of old candles removed and saved for other uses. The wax drips cleaned from the silver. The bedside candles in the bedroom, a candlestick and a box of matches, placed on the nightstand in case anyone needed light during the night, were renewed each morning. There was also, in the rooms where gas was used, the question of the light's quality. Victorian gaslight, while adequate for general illumination, was harsh and directional compared to what we are accustomed to. The reading of fine print required being close to the fixture. Work requiring colour discrimination, misses. Ashworth's embroidery, the examination of fabric samples for a new dress, the reading of detailed maps, was better done in daylight or by a particularly well-positioned lamp. The arrangement of furniture in relation to light sources was a conscious choice in Victorian interiors, and the housekeeper was attentive to whether the household's lamps and gas fittings were positioned to serve the practical as well as decorative needs of each room. Fire hazard was a constant concern. Victorian interiors were full of flammable materials, the heavy fabrics of the curtains and upholstery, the wooden furniture, the papers and books, the fabric and wood of the beds, and the open flames of candles, oil lamps, and fireplaces represented a real risk. Every fire in the house was managed with an awareness of this risk. Fire guards were placed in front of fireplaces in any room where children might be present, and it was standard practice to ensure that no fabric was hanging within reach of the grate. Candles in bedrooms were a particular anxiety. A candle left burning by a sleepy occupant who forgot to extinguish it before sleep was one of the most common causes of domestic fires. The nightly butler's circuit included a specific check that all candles and lamps were extinguished or secured. The horror of house fire was not abstract in the Victorian mind. The speed with which a well-furnished Victorian interior could ignite and spread fire was catastrophic, and there was no organised fire brigade of the modern kind in many areas during much of the century. Though London had the Metropolitan Fire Brigade from 1866, the insurance arrangements that Victorian households made, fire insurance was common among prosperous households, testify to the seriousness with which this risk was regarded. The precautions around fire management in the house were not excessive fussiness but practical prudence. Let us return for a moment to the question of coal and the whole coal economy of the Victorian house, because it shaped daily life in ways that are easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. Coal arrived at the house, delivered perhaps twice a month in winter, less frequently in summer, in a manner that was rather dramatic from the pavement's perspective. The coal wagon, horse-drawn, pulled up to the coal hole in the pavement, and the coalmen, blackened with coal dust from head to foot, a trade so physically demanding and dirty that it had its own distinctive working culture and somewhat threatening reputation in Victorian social imagination, shoveled the coal through the iron chute directly into the cellar below. The coal cellar would hold several tons, enough to see the household through several weeks in winter. The coal hole was then replaced, and the pavement swept clean, and the wagon moved on to the next address. The quality of the coal mattered. There were distinct grades of coal for different purposes, and a well-run Victorian household specified and obtained the right grade for each use. Anthracite burned cleanly and slowly, and was used for heating where a long, steady burn was needed. Coke, a processed form of coal with its volatile components removed, was used in some kitchen ranges and was considered cleaner burning. Ordinary household coal was the workhorse of the fireplaces, burning with the characteristic smell that permeated Victorian urban life. The coal bills were substantial and were a significant line in the household accounts that the housekeeper reviewed each month. The movement of coal from the cellar to the fireplaces was, as we have noted, a daily physical operation. But there was a subtler aspect to coal management too, the question of which fires were lit when. A large Victorian house could not practically keep every fireplace burning all day throughout the winter. The fuel cost would have been prohibitive even for wealthy households. Instead, fires were managed by priority. The kitchen range burned all day. The master's library fire was lit before breakfast and kept going while he was at home. The drawing room fire was lit in the afternoon before visitors were expected and in the evening for dinner. Bedroom fires were lit in the evening. Rooms not in use had fires laid ready but unlit, available to be started on short notice if the room was suddenly needed. This selective use of heat produced a Victorian house that was warm in its active zones and decidedly cool, often cold, in its secondary spaces. The large entrance hall, despite its impressive architecture, was typically cold, since heating such a high-ceilinged space efficiently was difficult, and it was occupied only briefly at the beginning and end of each visitor's time in the house. The back stairs were always cold. Corridors were drafty. The servants' attic rooms were cold at night. Only in the rooms designated for active use, where the fire had been burning for some time, was real warmth achieved, and that warmth was concentrated in the area nearest the fireplace, fading as you moved away toward the windows. This is one of the sensory details that is hardest to reconstruct imaginatively from the modern side of central heating. The way that thermal comfort in a Victorian interior was spatially uneven, with islands of warmth around the hearths and gradients of cold moving outward from there. You positioned yourself in relation to the fire as a matter of habitual awareness. You brought a shawl to the writing desk that was positioned near the window for the light. You chose the chair nearest the fire for your reading. Cold and warmth were not background conditions, but active features of the space. managed and navigated constantly. The coal fire's contribution to the atmosphere of the Victorian interior was also sensory in ways beyond mere warmth. The sound of a coal fire is distinctive and agreeable. The low, steady crackling and settling of coals, the occasional pop as a pocket of gas ignites, the deeper note of the chimney drawing strongly. The light of a coal fire is warm and dynamic, moving and flickering against the walls and ceiling, filling the room with a quality of light that no subsequent technology has fully replicated. The smell, the faint, slightly mineral smell of burning coal, overlaid with the wood smoke smell of kindling, was so universal in Victorian city life that most people within it would have barely registered it consciously, the way we barely register the smell of our own homes. But to step into a Victorian house from outside on a cold autumn evening, with the fires burning in their grates and the smell of coal warmth coming from every room, would have been to enter a specific sensory world whose texture was entirely particular. There is a quality to the overall sensory experience of a Victorian mansion in full operation that one wants to try to convey whole, not just in its individual components. The sounds alone were complex. The clock in the hall chiming the hours and quarters, its pendulum audible in the brief silences between. The click of doors opening and closing, the soft tread of feet on carpeted floors, the heavier sound of feet on bare wooden stairs behind the service doors, the sound of the kitchen, a distant, low-level roar of activity, pots and pans, voices, the range, that penetrated slightly even to the upper floors in a quiet house, the sound of the piano drifting from the drawing room in the afternoon, the sound of carriage wheels on the pavement outside, and the bell at the front door that set the footman in motion, and at night the quiet, the measured ticking of the clocks, the creaking of the house cooling, the sound of the wind around the chimney stacks, and, if you were lying awake in one of the bedrooms, the faint reassuring sound of the coal fire settling in the grate. The smells of the house layered one upon another in ways that varied by time of day and by location. The ground floor was dominated by the smells of the morning room and the library, cut flowers, paper, leather, furniture polish, the faintest trace of the sherry that was kept on the sideboard. The dining room during service had its own complex of smells: hot food, wine, the beeswax candles, the particular smell of warmed silver plate. The kitchen, on any afternoon when something serious was being produced for dinner, poured out a smell of concentrated cooking, roasting meat, reducing stocks, baking pastry, that reached the service corridor and the lower staircase in an entirely pleasant, appetite-stimulating wave. The laundry smell was its own: soap, steam, the faintly acrid smell of starch being pressed with a hot iron. The upper floors had a cooler, quieter scent: the clean smell of frequently changed bed linens, lavender bags placed among the linen in the cupboards, the powder and perfume of Mrs. Ashworth's dressing room, the particular mixture of good cloth and polished leather that characterized the master's dressing room. And in the servants' areas the smells were more functional: the kitchen smells that penetrated the scullery, the carbolic soap of the cleaning closet, the damp wool smell of recently washed fabric hung to dry, the blacking and metal smell of freshly polished boots, and above all the coal, in the coal cellar, in the scuttles being carried upstairs, in the fireplaces being cleaned. The coal smell ran through the servants' world like a thread connecting every task to the fundamental energy source that powered the whole enterprise. The visual texture of the house varied dramatically between the family's side and the servants'. In the reception rooms, every surface was managed: walls hung with silk or fine paper, or carefully chosen paints, carpets deep and patterned, curtains rich and heavy, their full precisely arranged, the paintings on the walls carefully hung and regularly dusted, furniture positioned to serve both function and appearance. The quality and arrangement of objects communicated the household's taste and prosperity in a language that every visitor would read instinctively, even if they could not have articulated exactly what they were reading. In the service areas, the visual language was entirely different: walls whitewashed or painted in plain cream, floors of stone or brick, covered at best with simple matting or uncovered entirely, wooden furniture of plain deal or pine, iron hooks for hanging things, no decoration, no pictures, nothing that served only appearance. The functional beauty of well-organized tools in a good kitchen, the rows of copper pans on their hooks, the ranked jars of preserved stores on their shelves, the knives laid out in their order of size, had its own kind of dignity, but it was the dignity of use rather than of display. The servants themselves moved through this world with a physical awareness of their surroundings that was second nature. Agnes knew exactly where each cleaning material was kept and could find it in the dark. The kitchen maid knew the weight and balance of each pan and which was the right one for each operation. The footman knew how to carry a tray loaded with crystal without a sound and to place each glass silently at its position at the table. The coachman knew the sound of each horse's breathing and could tell by its cadence whether all was well. This embodied expertise, developed over years of daily practice, was the real currency of the servants' world, the thing of actual value that they brought to the household and that the household entirely depended upon. The relationship between knowledge and invisibility in the Victorian servants' experience is worth sitting with for a moment. The servants knew the household in ways the family did not. The actual state of the basement stores, the amount of coal in the cellar, which guest bedroom's mattress was beginning to give, which drain was slow, which chimney was building up a deposit that would need sweeping before the winter, because they were in contact with the physical substance of the house every day in ways the family was not. The family occupied the pleasant surfaces of the house. The servants occupied the underlying reality. This created an interesting asymmetry of knowledge and power. The servants knew things about the family and the house that the family did not know about itself. They knew when money was tight, because economies appeared in the kitchen and the household purchasing. They knew when the master was unhappy, because the library decanter went down faster. They knew every physical quirk and deficiency of the house, and they were required, by the terms of their employment and the social understanding of the time, to keep all of this knowledge entirely to themselves and never to leverage it in any way. Discretion was not merely professionally appropriate in the Victorian servants' world. It was the fundamental ethic that made the entire system of intimate service possible, and this got bound by how. It was also, in many cases, genuinely observed. The relationship between long-serving senior servants and the families they worked for developed, over years and decades, into something that resembled loyalty in its deepest form. The butler who had managed a family's household for 20 years, who had navigated the births and deaths and social difficulties of that family's history, who held in his memory the full record of how the household had functioned across a generation, was not simply an employee. He was a holder of the family's institutional memory, and both he and the family understood this without necessarily saying it. When such a butler retired, usually to a small house near the family's country estate, with a pension that was more generous than his formal wages had suggested, the parting had qualities of genuine grief on both sides, though the Victorian social framework provided no vocabulary adequate to expressing it. The housemaid Agnes, at 22, was too young and too junior to have developed this kind of relationship with the household. She was conscious of the family as a set of requirements and preferences and schedules, not as individuals she truly knew, but the housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, who had been with the Ashworths for 11 years and had managed the house through the birth of 3 children, the death of one, a lengthy renovation, and the social vicissitudes of a decade, was a different matter. Mrs. Fletcher knew the house the way she knew her own body. She knew its needs, its vulnerabilities, its particular patterns of wear and aging. She managed it with the same kind of attentive care that a good shepherd gives to familiar land. This sense of the house as something that required management in the deepest sense, as an entity with its own character and needs, rather than simply a physical structure, runs through everything about the Victorian mansion's life that we have been exploring. The house was not passive. It required constant energy input to remain what it was: warm, clean, functional, beautiful, properly staffed, properly provisioned, properly managed. Without that input, continuously applied, it would slide toward a different state: cold, dusty, disorganized, socially inadequate. The maintenance of the house was the maintenance of the household's identity in the world, and that maintenance was never complete, never finished, never permitted a real day off. Wise, weekly rhythm of household tasks mapped out a cycle of continuous renewal. Monday was the laundry. Tuesday was when the weekly deep clean of the principal rooms was done. The furniture moved from its position and the carpet swept beneath it, the shelves of books dusted individually, the paintings checked and cleaned. Wednesday might bring the gardener's attention to the indoor plants and the flower arrangements. Thursday was baking day in many households, when the week's stocks of bread and cake and biscuits were produced in quantity. Friday was cleaning day for the silver and the more valuable decorative items. Saturday was general preparation for the week ahead, reviewing supplies, sending orders, attending to whatever repairs had accumulated. Sunday was the day of rest, though in a domestic household Sunday rest was relative, since meals still had to be produced and the basic maintenance of the house could not stop even on the Sabbath. What Sunday offered the servants was freedom from the deeper cleaning and preparation tasks, and perhaps an afternoon hour or two of genuine free time, which many used to attend church, write letters home, or simply sit quietly in their room. We have not yet spent enough time in the kitchen to do it justice, and the kitchen of a Victorian mansion deserves real attention because it was, in many ways, the most technically sophisticated and the most relentlessly active space in the entire establishment.
The kitchen, Mrs.
Henderson ruled was a large, high-ceilinged room with a flagstone floor and whitewashed walls. The kitchen range dominated the room's inner wall, its black iron surfaces warm even when the fires were moderate, its polished brass fittings catching the light. To one side, the range's boiler provided a constant supply of hot water to the kitchen, piped hot water being one of the genuine conveniences of this kitchen. The range had been installed in this house perhaps 15 years ago and was a good quality model that Mrs. Henderson had come to know intimately. She knew which part of the oven ran hot and compensated for it. She knew which of the hot plate sections held heat well and which cooled quickly. She knew the slight variance in the boiler's performance on very cold days when the incoming water temperature dropped. This knowledge was as much a part of her professional equipment as the recipes she carried in her head. The kitchen tables were of scrubbed deal, their white wooden surfaces worn smooth from years of daily use. A large central table served for most preparation work. A smaller side table was kept specifically for pastry making, because pastry required a cool surface, and the pastry table was positioned away from the range to take advantage of the kitchen's cooler corners. The marble slab on one end of the pastry table was used for chocolate work and for confections that required the temperature control that marble provided. The kitchen's storage was arranged with the precision of a well-organized laboratory. Dry goods, flour, sugar, salt, spices, dried fruits, pulses were stored in the dry larder off the kitchen, arranged on shelves in sealed containers that protected them from the dampness and the mice and other pests that were a constant challenge in Victorian kitchens, regardless of how carefully the house was managed. Mice were a reality of Victorian domestic life, and the household cat, usually a kitchen cat, fed on kitchen scraps and kept specifically for pest control, was a functional household employee rather than purely a pet. The cold larder, positioned on the north side of the house, held the perishable foods, the joints of meat hanging from their hooks, the fish in its ice, the dairy products in their covered bowls and crocks, the gelatins and cold preparations that needed keeping cool. Before refrigeration, and refrigeration in any domestic sense did not become available until the late Victorian period, and even then remained a luxury for the wealthy, the cold larder and the ice house were the only means of keeping perishable food over time, and their management required careful attention to temperature, turnover, and the signs of spoilage. And the ice house was one of the most interesting and least considered features of a well-appointed Victorian estate or large urban house. It was a below-ground chamber, often circular, with walls thick enough to provide thermal insulation, and it was filled in winter with blocks of ice cut from ponds and rivers, or, in urban areas, purchased from ice merchants who imported it from Norway or harvested it from higher altitude sources. Packed with straw or sawdust for additional insulation, the ice in a well-constructed ice house could last through most of the summer, providing the kitchen with a continuous supply for cooling perishable foods, making ice desserts. Frozen water ices and ice cream were fashionable dishes in the Victorian period, and for the sick room, where ice was considered a valuable therapeutic resource, the management of the ice house was the butler's responsibility in most households. He held the key and controlled access, doling out ice to the kitchen as required and monitoring the supply to ensure it lasted as long as possible. Ice from the ice house was used judiciously, not profligately, because the supply was finite and replenishment in summer was expensive. The ice merchant who called periodically to deliver fresh ice was one of the tradespeople whose service the household considered essential. The kitchen's relationship with its tradespeople was one of daily negotiation. The butcher called most mornings, and the daily choice of which cuts of meat and at what price was a conversation between the kitchen, represented by the cook, and the butcher's boy who brought the order and took the new one. This was a relationship developed over years, and it had its own dynamics. The butcher who supplied a household like this expected prompt payment and a certain volume of business, and in return was expected to provide good quality at fair prices and to honor special requests when they arose. The fishmonger called several times a week, the greengrocer daily or near daily, the baker 3 or 4 times a week for the finer breads that supplemented the kitchen's own baking. The relationship with the dairy, supplying milk, cream and butter fresh each day, was managed on a daily delivery schedule. The cook's management of these relationships and her ability to obtain good produce at fair prices from reliable suppliers was a significant part of her practical value to the household. A cook who could be consistently cheated by tradespeople, or who was unable to assess the freshness of fish or the quality of a cut of meat, was a liability. Mrs. Henderson had been in the trade long enough to have refined her eye and her nose to a degree of sensitivity that served the household well. She could tell by the color of a piece of beef whether it had been hung the right number of days. She could tell by the smell of a sole whether it had come out of the sea that morning or 2 days ago. She had established relationships with specific suppliers over years and knew which ones she could trust. The daily production of food in this kitchen was, in volume and variety, genuinely impressive. Breakfast for the family, luncheon, afternoon tea cakes and sandwiches, dinner for the family and any guests, and throughout the day the meals of the servants' hall, which needed to be nourishing and adequate even if they were not the elaborate productions served upstairs. A servants' hall dinner at midday might consist of a large boiled joint, root vegetables, potatoes, bread, and a simple pudding. The supper in the evening, after the family had dined, would be whatever was left from the family's dinner, supplemented by additional simple dishes as needed. The servants ate well, by the standards of the time, and compared to their counterparts outside service. Good, plentiful food was one of the practical benefits of domestic service that made the work attractive despite its other demands. The cook's professional knowledge was substantial and largely unacknowledged in the social accounting of the household's skills and value. She knew not only how to produce hundreds of individual dishes, but how to plan a menu that worked as a whole, that had the right balance of richness and lightness, that moved through courses in a way that built interest without fatiguing the appetite, that took account of seasonal ingredients and the family's known preferences. She knew the chemistry of pastry, why fat needed to be kept cold, why too much working of the dough produced toughness, why egg yolks and cream emulsified the way they did. She knew the science of stocks and sauces, why a stock needed long, slow simmering rather than aggressive boiling, why the scum needed to be removed repeatedly during the first stages, why a reduction produced the concentrated flavor that a sauce required. She had learned all of this not from books, but from years of working alongside, and then working under, and then working as the senior cook in a series of kitchens, each one adding to her practical knowledge. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861 and by the 1880s, a household reference in most prosperous kitchens, provided a codification of this accumulated knowledge in a form that was accessible to the literate but inexperienced, and it sat on a shelf in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen alongside other reference works. But the book was a supplement to experience rather than a substitute for it. The recipes in Beeton assumed a level of practical knowledge that the book itself could not fully convey. They told you the proportions and the sequence, but not the 1,000 small judgments, when the heat was right, when the consistency was correct, when the scent told you that a preparation had reached the stage it needed to reach, that the experienced cook carried in her senses and her hands. Victorian cooking was a discipline of sustained attention and physical engagement. The cook stood at the range for hours. She tasted constantly, adjusting seasoning and acidity and sweetness as she went. She moved between the range and the preparation table and the cold larder and back again, managing multiple processes simultaneously in a space that was warm enough in summer to be genuinely uncomfortable. She worked without any of the labor-saving equipment that modern kitchens provide as a baseline. No electric mixers, no food processors, no temperature-controlled ovens, no refrigeration. Everything was done by hand and by eye and by accumulated experience. The kitchen was also, in its way, a remarkable place of professional pride. A cook who could produce a dinner that satisfied 20 guests, who could time a delicate soufflé to arrive at the table at exactly the right moment, who could maintain the standard of the household's table day after day through the year. Such a person had real cause for satisfaction in their work, and the best Victorian cooks felt it and expressed it in the quality they brought to everything they produced. The hierarchy of the kitchen had its own honor. Being trained under a well-regarded cook was a significant advancement in a young kitchen maid's career, and being offered the position of cook in an increasingly prestigious household was the goal that motivated years of work. And yet the cook's role, like so much in the Victorian servants' world, was simultaneously of the highest practical importance and largely invisible to the people who benefited from it most directly. The dinner guests who praised the excellence of Mrs. Ashworth's table were praising her taste and management, not Mrs. Henderson's skill and labor. The mistress received the credit. The cook received her wages, and if she was lucky, a quiet acknowledgement from her employer that the dinner had been a success. As the afternoon of our October Thursday progressed toward evening, and the light outside the kitchen windows began to fail, the tempo of the kitchen work increased. There was a dinner party tonight, 8 guests, making 12 at table, and the house had been moving toward this event all day, its various operations converging on the moment when the guests arrived and the evening began. In the dining room, the butler and the footmen were completing the table. The 12-place settings were laid with surgical precision. Each cover was separated from the next by 18 inches, and the butler measured this with a ruler without embarrassment, because a well-laid table was a matter of professional standards rather than personal quirk. The glasses for each cover were grouped in a diamond formation, the water glass directly above the knife, the sherry glass to its right, the claret glass in front and between them, the champagne flute to one side. The number of knives and forks corresponded to the number of courses that required them, each one placed at the precise distance from the plate that long practice had established as correct. The fish knives were to the right of the soup spoons. The dessert fork and spoon lay above the plate. The sideboard held its appointments, the silver serving dishes that would receive the passed courses as they came up from the kitchen, the carving implements laid ready for the joint, the wine glasses for the red wines that would breathe at room temperature, the wine itself, the claret, the burgundy, the hock for the fish course, had been brought up from the cellar by the butler that afternoon and was now standing at room temperature or slightly cool as each wine required. The sherry was in its decanter, the champagne was in the ice bucket, which the footman would periodically replenish from the icehouse supply. A fifaloion this ishigti wine, the fifaloion dyed in poyons and roses, in white and pale pink, with fern fronds and stephanotis filling in the spaces, had been produced that afternoon by the head gardener working in the back garden's small conservatory, and they sat in their épergne at the centre of the table, their scent adding to the room's evening atmosphere. Upstairs in the dressing rooms, the family was preparing for the evening. Mrs. Ashworth was at her dressing table with Parker behind her, and the process of evening dress was underway, a process considerably more elaborate than the morning's arrangements. Evening dress for a Victorian woman of this position meant a formal gown with a low décolletage, the bodice cut to display the shoulders and upper chest, the long skirt sweeping back into the fashionable bustle silhouette of the 1880s. The gown was of silk or velvet, its colour chosen to flatter the wearer and to be appropriate to the occasion. Mrs. Ashworth's evening gown for tonight was a deep raspberry silk with a cream lace inset at the bodice and pearl buttons down the back, and Parker helped her into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had buttoned up this particular dress on 5 previous occasions and knew exactly which button caused a slight problem. The jewellery came out of the case. Pearls tonight, the triple string that had been a wedding gift from Mr. Ashworth's parents, with matching earrings, a diamond brooch at the center of the bodice, a bracelet of seed pearls and garnets on the right wrist. Each piece was considered and placed with purpose. The jewelry told a story about the wearer's social and economic position that every other woman in the room tonight would read accurately and without effort. The display was not vulgar, it was perfectly calibrated to the occasion and the company, which was itself a social skill, since underdressing for a formal dinner was as much a statement as overdressing, and both were noted. Mr. Ashworth's evening preparation was briefer and more prescribed by convention. White tie, which meant a white waistcoat and white bow tie worn with a tailcoat of black barathea. The valet had laid everything out. The shirt was starched to perfection. The white kid gloves were on the dressing table. The opera hat, a collapsible silk top hat that flattened for convenience, was on the hat stand. In this period, white tie was the standard for formal dinner parties, and its conventions allowed little variation. The interest and individuality were all on the female side of the table. The guests arrived at 7:30, as invited. The butler opened the door to the first carriage with the practiced gravity of someone who understood that the threshold of a formal house was a significant boundary, and that the act of receiving guests was itself a performance with its own requirements of manner and timing. He took the gentlemen's hats and sticks and the ladies' wraps and managed the introductions with an understated efficiency that made the whole process feel as natural as breathing. The guests were shown to the drawing room, where Mrs. Ashworth received with the warmth and ease that were her particular social gifts. Nearly embrins, the pre-dinner period in the drawing room, perhaps 45 minutes, was when the evening's social work was done. Introductions were made, conversations established, the groupings arranged that would determine who sat next to whom at dinner and what tone the evening would take. Mrs. Ashworth had thought about the placement carefully. She had put the elderly general, who was slightly deaf and occasionally pompous but socially indispensable, between two women she knew could manage him. She had put the newly married couple, who were somewhat shy, in a corner where they could manage their own conversation before dinner loosened things up. She had placed the witty lawyer in the center, where he would benefit the general table conversation. These arrangements had been planned and written out and discussed with the butler that morning, because the seating plan was as important as the menu in determining whether a dinner succeeded. "On peut main dire" was announced by the butler, moving silently to Mrs. Ashworth's side and saying quietly that dinner was served. The company moved to the dining room in the order that precedence required, and the evening began in earnest. The dinner service proceeded with the choreographed precision that the butler and his footman had rehearsed and practiced and honed over years. The soup tureen appeared. The wine glasses were filled. The first course was cleared. The fish arrived on its great silver platter, carried by the senior footman at exactly the right height to be placed on the sideboard without catching the light of the candelabra, and so on through the courses, each one arriving at the right moment after its predecessor had been properly consumed, each one removed promptly enough that no empty plate sat before a guest for more than a minute. Heniho, be. The conversation around the table was lively, ranging from the political news of the week. The late Victorian period was one of intense political activity, with Gladstone and the Irish question dominating the parliamentary scene, to the social events of the season, to the various interests and topics that the gathered guests happened to bring. Mr. Ashworth presided at the head of the table with the ease of a practiced host, steering conversations, drawing in quieter guests, managing the rhythm of the table's attention with the same skill that his wife had applied to the composition of the gathering. The wines were excellent. The butler had done well with this year's cellar, and the dinner itself, which Mrs. Henderson had been building toward all day, was a genuine success. The turbot was perfect, its flesh just firm, the sauce delicate. The fillet of beef, carved at the sideboard by the butler with his long-practiced accuracy, was pink at the center and brown at the edges. The soufflé, a chocolate soufflé as the sweet course, a risky choice that Mrs. Henderson had made knowing that the timing was critical, arrived at the table at the precise moment it was needed, tall and perfect, and a small sound of appreciation ran around the table that the footman standing near the service door would relay to the kitchen before he returned for the next course. The women withdrew at 10 o'clock. The men passed the port. By 11 the company was reassembling in the drawing room, and the evening was entering its final stage. By midnight, the first carriages were being called, and by midnight the last guests had gone, and the house was returning to itself. The clearing proceeded. The silver moved to the butler's pantry. The kitchen maids tackled the aftermath of the evening's production. The footmen stripped the table and prepared the dining room for tomorrow, and eventually, in the small hours of the morning, the house settled into its quiet. The seasons changed the texture of the house's life considerably, and it is worth spending some time with the ways that the Victorian mansion responded to the year's turning. Summer brought the movement of the household to the country if the family had a country house, and the London house was reduced to a skeleton staff, a caretaker, and perhaps 1 or 2 housemaids to keep the dust at bay, the kitchen closed or running at minimal capacity, the furniture covered in dust sheets to protect it from the light. The main household would reconstitute itself at the country estate, where the outdoor staff expanded to manage the gardens and the shooting and the additional entertaining that the country season involved, and the indoor staff would need to adapt to a different physical space with its own requirements. Winter in the London house had its own character. The shorter days and the longer evenings meant more reliance on artificial light and more time spent in the lit, heated interior rooms. The coal consumption increased significantly. The cold that crept in at the windows and under the doors was managed by the stuffing of draft excluders, long tubes of fabric filled with sand or sawdust placed at the base of every exterior door, and by the addition of internal window shutters folded back against their reveals during the day and closed at night to add a layer of insulation. The heavy curtains of the reception rooms were drawn earlier in the afternoon as the light failed. Winter was also the season of the great social round of the London season, and the household's entertaining was at its most intensive. The dining room saw formal dinners 2 or 3 times a week in the height of the season. The drawing room was used for the afternoon calls and for occasional small musical evenings that were a fashionable form of intimate entertaining in this period. The morning room functioned as a social switchboard, managing the flow of cards and invitations and correspondence that the season generated. The preparation of the house for the season was itself a significant operation. Carpets that had been sent to be cleaned were returned and relaid. Curtains that had been taken down and stored during the summer were rehung and freshened. Furniture that had been in dust sheets was uncovered and checked and polished. The silver that had been in storage was inventoried and cleaned. The wine cellar was surveyed and replenished against the anticipated demands of a full season's entertaining. The kitchen was restocked. The staff was brought back to full strength if any positions had been filled temporarily during the summer. The housekeeper made her thorough inspection of every room and prepared her lists of what needed attention before the season began in earnest. And zoot, there was a particular pleasure, if you were attuned to it, in a house being brought back to full life after a period of reduced activity. The smell of the rooms warming up as the fires were lit again, the sounds of the full household returning, voices in the servants' hall, the clatter of the kitchen in preparation, the sound of carriages at the door, the vases freshly filled with flowers, the polished surfaces catching the afternoon light, the house becoming itself again, the complex organism resuming its full metabolism after a long, slow breath. The servants felt this too, in their way. The return to London meant the return to the familiar rhythm of a house they knew, with all its specific requirements and all the small satisfactions of work done well in a known setting. It also meant the return to the long hours and the constant demands of a fully operational household. But these were not simply in opposition. The satisfaction and the demand were the same thing from different angles. Let us think now about what it meant to live in this house as one of the family, not in the formal social sense that we have been largely discussing, but in the intimate daily sense, the texture of ordinary days that were not formal dinners or morning call days. An ordinary quiet morning in the house had a particular quality of suspended time that the busier days did not. If the master was at his club or his office and the mistress had no calls expected, The house moved through its tasks in a different mode, purposeful but unhurried, the various routines proceeding simultaneously throughout the building without the tight coordination that entertaining required. Agnes moved through the rooms with her dusting and her fires in a kind of productive solitude that was one of the genuine pleasures of the work when the work was going well. Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen prepared for luncheon with the steady concentration that simple cooking required. The housekeeper made her rounds and then settled in her room with the account books. Mrs. Ashworth on such a morning might be at her writing desk in the morning room, working through the correspondence that accumulated constantly, letters to be answered, invitations to be responded to, notes of thanks for recent hospitality, letters to friends and relations, the management of household business by pen. Her handwriting was clear and individual, her style of expression well formed through years of practice. The writing of letters was a social skill as important as the verbal ones, and it occupied a significant portion of the morning in a household of this kind. Or she might be at her embroidery frame, working on one of the large needlework projects that were considered an appropriate occupation for ladies of leisure and that could absorb hours of pleasurable attention. The silks spread around the frame, the gradations of colour carefully organised, the needle moving through the canvas in a rhythm that had its own meditative quality. Embroidery of this kind, a large fire screen panel perhaps, or a set of chair covers, the work of months, was simultaneously decorative production, social performance. The woman at her needlework was an approved image of feminine virtue and genuine craft. The children, on such a morning, would be in the schoolroom with the governess, Miss Arnold, attending to their lessons in French and arithmetic and history and music and drawing. The schoolroom had its own domestic order, the lesson books lined on their shelves, the copybooks waiting for the neat handwriting practice that would occupy the first half hour, the French reader that the oldest girl found difficult and the youngest one too easy. Miss Arnold was a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances, the typical profile of the Victorian governess, educated enough to teach but without the independent means that would have freed her from the necessity of employment, who occupied an uncomfortable social position between the family and the servants, dining with the family when no guests were present, and being treated with a certain courtesy that was not quite equality. In the afternoon, after luncheon, the tempo of the house changed again. This was the time for the departure of calls, when Mrs. Ashworth might make her own morning calls on other households, or take the children for a drive in the park, and for the receipt of callers. The drawing-room was readied, the tea things were prepared, the cake stand was filled, the footman was at his station in the hall. Victorian afternoon visiting had its own elaborate etiquette, most of which centred on the calling card. The card was not merely a piece of pasteboard with a name on it. It was a social instrument of considerable precision. A full visit, in which the caller was received by the mistress of the house, was indicated by leaving a card with the corner turned down in a specific way. A visit in which the caller was not at home, or in which the caller did not wish to be received but wanted to indicate that they had fulfilled their social obligation, was indicated by simply leaving a card in the hall tray without turning the corner. Cards left by a married couple, a husband and wife calling together, were different in number from those left by a single caller, according to a system of conventions so elaborate that books were written to explain it. The tray of accumulated calling cards in the hall was itself a document of the household's social life, and Mrs. Ashworth was attentive to it. She would review it each afternoon to see who had called, to note which visits needed returning, to assess whether any notable person had called whose return visit she should prioritize. The social reciprocity managed through this system of calls and cards was a full-time occupation in its own right during the height of the season, and it was managed with the same methodical attention that the housekeeper brought to the linen inventory. There is something quietly wonderful, if you let yourself appreciate it, about the social infrastructure of the Victorian upper-middle-class life. It was, in its way, an enormously sophisticated system for managing a large number of social relationships simultaneously in a period when there was no telephone, no electronic communication of any kind, and when all relationship maintenance had to happen through physical presence or the physical medium of handwriting. The morning call, the calling card, the formal dinner, the afternoon tea, the note of thanks, the letter of congratulation. These were the technologies of social connectivity available to this world, and they were developed and refined to a degree of precision that reflects both the importance of social relationships to this class of people and the seriousness with which those relationships were managed. The formal dinner, which we have examined in its practical operation, was also a social technology in this deeper sense. A dinner party was not merely a pleasurable occasion. It was an opportunity to confirm existing relationships, to introduce new ones, to manage social obligations, to signal the household's position and taste to people whose opinion mattered. The selection of guests for a dinner was a political act, requiring the navigation of who could be placed in the same room without awkwardness, who could be invited given the social obligations the family had accumulated, who would benefit the conversation and who might disrupt it. This calculation was part of Mrs. Ashworth's daily work, even when there was no dinner imminent. The formal calling and visiting etiquette also existed in relation to death, which was one of the most visibly managed experiences of Victorian social life. When a household experienced a death, the rituals were elaborate and well understood. The house was put into mourning, black crape was hung at the door, the servants wore black armbands, the family's dress was restricted to black or grey according to the degree of mourning and the distance of the relationship to the deceased. Calls of condolence were made and received. The mourning period had prescribed lengths: a year for a spouse, 6 months for a parent, 3 months for a sibling, and the gradual relaxation of mourning dress from deep black to half-mourning grey and purple was itself a visible social signal of the family's passage through grief. Victorian attitudes toward death were, in certain respects, more direct than our own. Death happened at home, in the household. The body was laid out in the house before the funeral. Children were not sheltered from the fact of a family member's death in the way that contemporary practice often seeks to protect them. Funerals were large social occasions involving the full social network of the family and were expensive, elaborate affairs that represented one of the Victorian period's significant forms of display. The funeral monument in the church or the cemetery was a lasting expression of the family's grief and its social position, and families invested in these monuments accordingly. But Victorian life also had, in the structures of its daily domestic routine, an approach to time and mortality that is harder to define but perhaps more important. The house's daily rhythm, the fires in the morning, the meals at their appointed hours, the weekly cycle of tasks, the seasonal round of the year, provided a framework of continuity that held the household together across the disruptions of illness, death, and change. The housekeeper who continued her morning rounds through grief, the cook who produced the family's dinner on the day after a bereavement, the butler who continued to manage the dinner service in the weeks following a loss. These continuities were not mere professional obligation. They were a form of care, the care of one human being for another, expressed through the maintenance of normalcy in a world that had momentarily stopped making sense. This is perhaps the deepest thing to say about the Victorian mansion as a living system, that it was not simply a machine for producing social performances, though it was that too. It was a place where life happened, in all its complexity and sorrow and joy, and where the structures of daily routine provided both the stage for those events and a form of support through them. The warm fire, the reliable meal, the clean room, the fresh flower in the vase, these small gestures of order and beauty were not trivial in the midst of a life that contained real difficulty. They were the daily proof that the world could be managed, that effort could produce beauty, that care could maintain what was worth maintaining. As the October evening deepened and the dinner party ran toward its close, the house turned slowly toward its nighttime state. The last carriage wheels clattered away on the pavement outside. The drawing-room, briefly emptied of its guests, was quiet in a particular way, the spent energy quiet of a room that had done its social work for the evening. The fire burned low in the grate. The flowers on the mantelpiece were slightly wilted from the warmth. The teacups were on the tray for the footman to collect. The candles in the candelabra had burned down an inch. The butler made his circuit. He checked the dining-room window fastenings. He confirmed the silver was secured. He walked through the hall and confirmed the front door was bolted. He stood for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the last sounds of clearing. Satisfying himself that the range was safely banked, he looked into the scullery, where the last of the washing up was being completed. He moved quietly through the ground floor, his presence itself a kind of guarantee that the house was in order. The footmen finished their duties and went to their beds in the upper servants' quarters. The housemaids had retired an hour before, exhausted after a long day that had begun at 5:30. The kitchen maid and the scullery maid finished the last of the washing up and cleaned the kitchen surfaces for the morning. Mrs. Henderson covered the range, banked the coals, and removed her apron for the last time that day. Oh, Mrs. Ashworth, already in her night clothes after Parker's careful attention, was reading by the light of her beside lamp one of the later novels from Mudie's before she felt sleepy enough to extinguish the light and settle for the night. The house's particular nighttime silence gathered around her. Not absolute silence, because a house is never absolutely silent, but the distinctive quiet of a place that has done its work for the day and is resting. The clock on the mantel ticked. A coal shifted in the grate. Outside, very faintly, the sound of a late carriage on the street. Hall. The housekeeper's candle was the last to go out as she finished the last of her notes and closed her account book. The house was in order. Tomorrow's work was planned. The stores were adequate. The fires were safe. The silver was locked. The family was comfortable. In 6 hours, Agnes would be up again, and the whole beautiful, exhausting, invisible, indispensable machinery of the Victorian mansion would begin its day once more. There is something to sit with in that image as you settle towards sleep. The house, quiet now in the small hours, all its complexity at rest for these few hours before the day demands it again. The coal in the range holding its heat through the night, the silver locked in its case, the polished furniture in the dark rooms, the banked fires in their grates, tended with such care, doing their slow work through the cold hours toward the morning. The whole establishment, the dozens of people whose labor kept it functioning, the family whose life it organized and contained, the building itself with its 100 years of accumulated character, all of it breathing together in the October dark. The house, and all its stories, waiting for morning. The specifics of Victorian domestic technology deserve some more attention before we fully close our exploration of this world, because the technologies involved were genuinely interesting and say a great deal about what the period valued and what it was willing to invest in. Let us think about clocks, for example. Time management in a Victorian household was not merely a matter of social convention, it was a logistical necessity. With a large staff performing tasks that needed to be synchronized, the morning rooms needed to be clean before the family came down, the fires needed to be burning before the family arrived in each room, the dinner needed to be ready at the precise moment announced. The accurate keeping of time was a real operational requirement. The Victorian house was full of clocks, the bracket clock on the library mantel, the long case clock in the hall, the small carriage clock on the morning room desk, the stable clock in the mews yard. The housekeeper had her own watch, the butler had his, the kitchen had its clock. These were not decorative objects, though they were also decorative. They were functional instruments for coordinating the many simultaneous processes of the household. The regulation of these clocks was the butler's responsibility. Each week he made a round of the house's timepieces, checking them against the correct time obtained from the time ball at the Greenwich Observatory, or, more practically, from the daily delivery of the newspaper and its comparison with a known accurate reference instrument. The Victorian obsession with punctuality, the dinner served at the exact announced hour, the calls made within the prescribed time windows, the family's morning appearing at the time specified by the household's schedule, was not mere convention. It was the mechanism by which the household's logistics were coordinated. A household whose schedules were unreliable was a household whose operations were incoherent, whose servants did not know when things were expected, whose kitchen could not time the preparation of meals. Punctuality was the fundamental operating parameter of the household's function. The bells that connected the family's rooms to the servants' areas were another technology worth attention. The Victorian bell system, a network of wire pulls connected to a board of labelled bells in the servants' hall or kitchen, was one of the period's practical domestic innovations, and it transformed the working of the house significantly. Before the widespread installation of bell systems, summoning a servant required raising one's voice or sending one servant to find another. The bell system allowed any room in the house to communicate a request to the service areas with a single pull, without any human intermediary, and with sufficient specificity. The label on the bell indicated which room was calling, that the appropriate servant could respond. The installation of a bell system required threading wires through the walls of the house, which in new construction could be done as part of the original build, and in existing houses required a degree of retrofitting. The wires ran in channels behind the plaster or through drilled holes in the structure, connecting to small circular bells mounted on a board in the servants' hall, each one with a label indicating the room whose pull it corresponded to. The system required regular maintenance. Wires stretched over time and needed adjustment, bells occasionally went out of alignment, pulls in rooms wore out and needed replacement. Beyond the bells, the speaking tube was a more recent innovation that some well-appointed houses had adopted by the 1880s. A speaking tube was simply a tube of metal or rubber running between 2 points in the house through which voices could be transmitted, the acoustic equivalent of a telephone, operating without any electrical component. Tubes connecting the kitchen to the butler's pantry or the master's bedroom to the servants' stairs allowed instructions to be given and messages to be passed without physical movement. Their use was limited to point-to-point communication between specific locations, but within those limits they were genuinely useful. The bathroom and plumbing technology, which we touched on earlier, was in a state of active development through the Victorian period. The earliest fixed baths in British domestic buildings date from the 1820s and 1830s, though they remained uncommon until the middle of the century. By the 1880s, new construction and renovation of larger houses increasingly incorporated fixed plumbing, with hot and cold water supplied to bathrooms and water closets. The technology of the water supply depended on either a tank in the roof space, filled by the main supply and providing pressure through gravity, or a more complex arrangement of pumps. Hot water was supplied from a boiler in the basement, heated by its own coal fire or by connection to the kitchen range's boiler. The water closet technology of the period had achieved a reasonable degree of reliability by the 1880s, though the variety of designs available and the variable quality of installation meant that performance differed considerably between houses. The best examples of the period, with their washdown or washout mechanisms, close-coupled cisterns, and well-designed traps, worked reliably and effectively. The porcelain bowls were often objects of considerable decorative ambition. The transfer-printed designs of cobalt blue on white, produced by the major sanitary pottery manufacturers, had a decorative quality entirely suited to the Victorian taste for applied ornament on functional objects. The argand oil lamp, which we mentioned in the context of lighting, deserves a brief pause because it was one of the period's technical accomplishments and remained in use alongside gas even after the widespread installation of gas fittings in principal rooms. The argand lamp, invented in the 1780s and refined continuously through the following decades, burned colza oil or paraffin in a circular wick mechanism that produced a bright, reasonably steady flame with much less smoke than an ordinary candle or oil lamp. The glass chimney that surrounded the flame acted to stabilize the combustion and to concentrate the light. In a well-maintained example, an argand lamp gave excellent reading light, but it required daily cleaning and trimming and refilling, as we have noted, and the lamp room where this maintenance was performed was a specific service space in any house that used these lamps in quantity. The transition to gas lighting, which happened gradually, room by room and house by house, through the middle decades of the 19th century, represented a genuine improvement in the practical quality of interior illumination. Gas produced a steadier, brighter light than any oil lamp or candle, and it required much less daily maintenance once the system was installed and properly adjusted. The gas mantle, introduced in the 1880s, increased the brightness and improved the quality of the light still further. But gas also introduced hazards: the risk of unlit jets allowing gas to accumulate, the health effects of prolonged exposure to combustion products in poorly ventilated spaces that required their own management protocols. The household technology of this period was, taken as a whole, the product of a century of incremental improvement in the practical conditions of domestic life. Each improvement, the range over the open hearth, the bell system over shouting, fixed plumbing over the daily labor of carrying water, gas over oil and candles, reduced certain forms of physical labor and certain management requirements. But the improvements were partial and uneven, and they did not reduce the total labor of the household in any simple way. Instead, they shifted it. Labor that had gone into certain tasks was freed to be invested in higher standards of those same tasks, or in new ones that the improved technology made possible. The kitchen range enabled a larger menu and more elaborate preparation. Fixed plumbing made daily bathing conceivable, where weekly bathing had been the previous standard. Gas lighting extended the hours of the working day in service rooms. The improvements made the house more ambitious, not less demanding. This is a pattern worth recognizing because it speaks to something enduring about the relationship between technology and labor. The Victorian household was at one end of the chain, whose other end is our own world of dishwashers and electric ovens and washing machines and instant hot water from every tap. And at every point along that chain, the pattern has been the same. New technology does not reduce the work so much as it raises the standard. The house today that the owners expect to maintain at the level of cleanliness and organization that was impossible without domestic servants in the Victorian period uses its technological equipment to achieve what previously required armies of human hands. Whether we are better off for the exchange, and in many ways we obviously are, or whether we have lost something in the process of making it all invisible and automatic, is a question that our journey through the Victorian mansion might leave us better equipped to consider. What the Victorian household had, at its best, was a consciousness of its own operations that is largely absent from domestic life today. The coal that kept the house warm was counted and managed. The laundry was a weekly event of substantial labor that everyone in the house was aware of. The dinner required a day of visible preparation. The morning cleaning proceeded audibly through the house as the family breakfasted. The mechanics of daily life were present to everyone in the household in ways that our automated, invisible domestic infrastructure does not provide. The household was transparent to itself in its operations, if not always in its social dynamics. Whether that transparency was comfortable or not depended entirely on which part of the household you occupied. For the family, the visibility of the household's operations was managed, the labor rendered appropriately invisible, the experience curated toward comfort and beauty. For the servants, the operations were entirely transparent because they were the operations. There was no distance between the work and the worker, no buffer of automation, no relief from the physical and logistical reality of keeping a large house functioning. But there was also, for both sides of this world, something that we might genuinely miss, the sense that the house was alive, that it was maintained by continuous human effort and attention, that the warmth and the clean surface and the fresh flour were the product of specific people's specific care. The anonymous automated comfort of modern domestic life has its genuine advantages, the freedom from drudgery, the democratic availability of warmth and cleanliness, but it has replaced something too. The knowledge of where things come from, the relationship between effort and comfort, the human presence behind the material world of daily life. The Victorian mansion, for all the injustice of the social structures that produced it, was in this one sense supremely human. Every aspect of it was the product of human labor, human knowledge, human skill, and human care. Not always joyful labor, not always freely given, not always adequately rewarded, but human, unmistakably and inescapably human, from the banked fire in the range at midnight, to the polished silver on the dinner table, to the precisely folded corner of the bedsheet. As you drift towards sleep, let the house settle around you in your imagination. The October night is cold, but the rooms are warm. The coal fires have been burning since morning, and the walls themselves have absorbed the day's warmth. The dinner was good. The house is quiet. The clocks tick in their various registers, the deep, measured tick of the long case in the hall, the lighter, faster tick of the bracket clock in the library, and the sound of them together is the sound of a house at peace with its own duration. Somewhere in the basement, the range ticks softly as the banked coals settle. Somewhere in the attic, Agnes sleeps with the deep sleep of someone who has worked hard and completed what needed to be done. The butler has checked the silver, the housekeeper has noted tomorrow's requirements. The flowers on the morning room table are slightly past their best and will be replaced in the morning. The house does not stop, not exactly, but it breathes more slowly in these dark hours, its operations reduced to the minimum required to maintain the warmth and the security and the order that will allow tomorrow to begin from the same starting point as today. The Victorian mansion was, in the end, a daily demonstration of what sustained human effort and attention can produce. Not effortless, not automatic, not invisible, though it worked hard to seem all three of those things, but achieved, every single day, by the labor of dozens of people who knew their tasks and performed them with the particular pride that comes from mastery. There is a kind of beauty in that, even now, even at this distance, especially at this distance. Sleep well, the house is in good hands, and if you found your way here through sleepy old world, and this kind of storytelling felt like the right company for the hour, thank you for staying to the end. The next journey is already waiting for you, whenever you're ready. Until then, let the quiet and the warmth do their work. Good night.